There are places in this world that defy explanation. They exist just beyond the edge of our understanding, hidden in the shadows of our fears. Eldergrove was one such place, a village surrounded by rolling hills and dense forests, where people lived quietly, their lives touched by an ever-present dread. Eldergrove was a place where the darkness wasn't just a backdrop, it was alive, breathing just beneath the surface, waiting for the moment to reach out and pull you under. And nowhere was that darkness more palpable than in the Whispering Woods. No one in Eldergrove ventured into the woods after nightfall. The villagers spoke of it in hushed tones, telling stories of those who had entered the forest and never returned. The woods had a way of swallowing people whole, leaving nothing but an echo of their last terrified breaths. Yet, despite the warnings, there was always one who couldn't resist the pull of the unknown, one who believed that the stories were just stories, that the darkness held no power over them. This time, that one was Layla. Layla was different from the others in Eldergrove. While they cowered in the face of the unknown, she felt an insatiable curiosity gnawing at her, urging her to seek out the truth. The stories of the Whispering Woods fascinated her, the thought of an entire forest alive with voices, holding secrets that had been buried for centuries. So, on a cold, foggy autumn evening, Layla made the decision that would change her life forever. She would enter the woods. As she crossed the threshold of the forest, the air seemed to change, growing colder, denser, as if the trees themselves were aware of her presence. The fog thickened around her, curling around her legs like ghostly fingers. The lantern she carried cast only the faintest light, barely piercing the oppressive darkness. But it wasn't the dark that unnerved her, it was the silence. A silence so deep that it seemed unnatural, as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Layla walked deeper into the woods, the path twisting and turning, leading her into the heart of the forest. The trees towered above her, their branches tangled and knotted, blocking out the sky. It was then that she heard it, the first whisper. It was faint, barely more than a breath, but it was unmistakable. A voice, soft and low, speaking a language she couldn't understand. She stopped, straining to listen, but the whisper faded into darkness. Layla continued walking, her heart pounding in her chest, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. They seemed to come from all around her, from the trees, the ground, the air itself. A chorus of voices, some weeping, others laughing, all blending together in a maddening cacophony. And then, as suddenly as they had started, the whispers stopped. Layla found herself standing in front of an ancient oak, its gnarled trunk twisted and blackened as if it had been struck by lightning. The ground beneath her feet was soft, almost spongy, and a chill ran down her spine as she realized it wasn't just earth she was standing on. It was something else, something that pulsed with a dark energy, something alive. At the base of the oak, half buried in the soil, she saw it, a small, weathered box. She knelt down, brushing away the dirt, her fingers trembling. The box was old, the wood cracked and dry, yet it felt oddly warm to the touch. She hesitated, a sense of dread creeping over her, but her curiosity won out. With a deep breath, she opened the box. Inside were coins, ancient and tarnished, and a piece of parchment covered in strange, cryptic symbols. But as she touched the parchment, a sudden wave of cold washed over her, and the air around her seemed to ripple. The whispers returned, louder now, more urgent. And the ground beneath her feet began to shift, as if something was moving just beneath the surface. A figure had emerged from the shadows, stepping into the dim light of her lantern. It was an old man, his skin pale and translucent, his eyes dark voids that seemed to swallow the light. He stared at her, his expression one of sorrow and regret. When he spoke, his voice was like the rustling of dead leaves, dry and brittle. "You should have not come here," he said, his voice echoing in the silence. "This place is cursed, bound by a darkness that feeds on those who dare seek its secrets. I am the keeper of this forest, condemned to guard it for all eternity. But you have awakened something far worse. Before Layla could react, the ground beneath her gave way and she fell, the earth swallowing her up like quicksand. She tried to scream, but the darkness choked the sound, and the last thing she saw was the old man's face, watching her with pity as she was pulled into the depths. She awoke in total darkness, the air thick with the stench of decay. She was underground, buried alive, her body trapped in a narrow space that pressed in on all sides. Panic set in as she realized she couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The whispers returned, louder than ever, but now they were inside her head, filling her mind with visions of torment and despair, the voices of who had come before her, all trapped, all suffering. She clawed at the earth, desperate to escape, but it was no use. The forest had claimed her, as it had claimed so many others before. And as the last of the air left her lungs, she understood the truth. The Whispering Woods weren't just haunted. They were a prison, a place where the souls of the damned were trapped for all eternity, their whispers a warning that no one heeded. The villagers never saw Layla again. They whispered about her, speculating on what might have happened, but none dared to enter the woods to search for her. They knew the truth, deep down, even if they didn't say it out loud. The Whispering Woods had taken her, and she had become another voice in the dark, another whisper in the night. And so the forest remained, silent and watchful, waiting for the next curious soul to step too close. In the heart of the city, tucked away on a narrow cobblestone street, there's a bookstore unlike any other. From the outside, it appears ordinary, dusty windows, a faded sign, and shelves crammed with old, forgotten books. But step inside, and you'll feel it instantly. The air is thick with the weight of untold stories, the kind that seem to whisper to you as you pass by. The bookstore is alive, a place where the boundary between reality and fiction blurs, where every book has a story to tell, and some of those stories are more dangerous than others. Mrs. Whimsy's bookshop had been a fixture in the city for as long as anyone could remember. The shop was a labyrinth of narrow aisles, towering bookshelves, and dusty volumes that seemed to have been forgotten by time itself. But it wasn't just the books that made the store special. It was the feeling that came over you the moment you stepped inside, a sense of being watched, of being surrounded by something ancient and powerful. One rainy evening, a young boy named Tom, seeking shelter from the storm, stumbled into the shop. The moment he crossed the threshold, he felt a strange sensation, as if the very air in the shop was alive, pulsing with a quiet energy. The bell above the door chimed, but instead of a cheerful ring, it sounded low and ominous, sending a shiver down his spine. Mrs. Whimsy, the shop's elderly owner, appeared from behind a bookshelf, her eyes twinkling with a knowing gleam. She was a peculiar woman, with wild gray hair and clothes that seemed to belong to another era. She greeted Tom with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes and led him deeper into the shop, past shelves filled with books that hummed with an eerie vibrancy. As they walked, Tom couldn't shake the feeling that the books were watching him, their spines turned slightly as if to follow his movements. He could hear faint whispers, just on the edge of his hearing, and the flickering candlelight cast long, distorted shadows that danced along the walls. Mrs. Whimsy stopped in front of an ancient, leather-bound tome and handed it to Tom. "This one," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "has been waiting for you." Tom took the book, its cover cool to the touch despite the warmth of the room. The title was embossed in gold, but the letters were faded and worn. He opened it, and as he did, a chill ran through the room. The pages were filled with dense, old-fashioned script, but what caught Tom's eye was the illustration on the first page, a beautiful yet haunting garden bathed in the moonlight, with twisted trees and a dark figure standing among them. Mrs. Whimsy watched him intently as he read, her expression unreadable. "This is no ordinary book," she murmured. "It's a doorway, a gateway to a world where stories come to life. But be warned, not all stories are meant to be told." Tom, intrigued and unnerved, continued reading. As he did, the world around him began to shift. The bookstore faded, replaced by the garden from the book. The air was thick with the scent of night-blooming flowers and something darker, more sinister. The figure in the garden turned, revealing a face twisted in anguish, eyes that bore into Tom's soul. The garden was not just a setting. It was a place, real and alive, and Tom had been pulled into it. He tried to close the book, but his hands wouldn't obey. The shadows in the garden began to move, creeping closer, whispering his name. He felt a presence behind him, cold breath on his neck, and when he turned, there was nothing but darkness. Mrs. Whimsy's voice echoed in his mind, growing fainter with each word. Some stories should remain unread. In a final act of desperation, Tom tore his gaze away from the book and flung it to the ground. The connection broke, and he found himself back in the bookstore, gasping for breath, his heart pounding in his chest. The book lay closed at his feet, but the whispers still lingered in the air, a reminder of the world he had almost been trapped in. Mrs. Whimsy bent down and picked up the book, her eyes gleaming with an eerie satisfaction. "You've seen what lies beyond the pages," she said softly, "but remember, the story truly never ends. It's always waiting, just beyond the next page, for someone curious enough to seek it out." Tom fled the bookstore, the rain drenching him as he ran through the streets, the whispers from the book still echoing in his mind. He never returned to Mrs. Whimsy's shop, but he knew that the book was still there, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to open its pages and become part of its story. And in the heart of the city, down a narrow, cobblestone street, Mrs. Whimsy's bookshop remains. The books still whisper, the shadows still dance, and the stories, they're always waiting. There's a place where the land meets the sea, where the relentless waves crash against jagged cliffs, and the wind howls like a chorus of lost souls. That place is Seacliff, a small, desolate town with a dark history. But it's not the town that the people fear. It's the lighthouse that stands at the edge of the cliffs. Its light a solitary beacon in the endless night. For decades, the lighthouse has been shrouded in mystery, its walls echoing with the cries of the damned. They say that the lighthouse is haunted, and those who dare to question the stories often find themselves comforting horrors beyond their wildest imaginations. Seacliff's lighthouse had stood for over a century, guiding ships safely through the treacherous waters of the coast. But its light wasn't the only thing that shone in the darkness. The townsfolk whispered of strange occurrences within its walls, cold drafts that came from nowhere, disembodied footsteps echoing in the dead of night, and the ghostly figure of a young woman who appeared during storms, her eyes filled with sorrow. The lighthouse keeper, Harold, had lived in the lighthouse for years, his life intertwined with its dark past. He was a solitary man, content with his quiet existence. But the stories of the haunting weighed heavily on him. He had seen things, unexplained movements in the shadows, fleeting glimpses of the ghostly woman, and objects that seemed to move on their own. But Harold was not a man to be easily frightened. He believed that the lighthouse held no power over him, that the spirits were simply echoes of the past, harmless and bound to the walls they haunted. Then came the night of the great storm. The wind howled like a banshee, and the sea roared with fury as the storm battered the coast. The lighthouse swayed in the gale, its beams slicing through the darkness, a lone sentinel in the chaos. Harold was in the lantern room, tending to the light, when he heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible sobbing. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The sobbing grew louder, more desperate, and he realized it was coming from the stairs. With a sense of dread, Harold descended the spiral staircase, the sobbing echoing around him. The air grew colder with each step, and the light from his lantern flickered as if struggling against the dark. He reached the bottom of the stairs, and there she was, Emily, the ghostly figure the townsfolk spoke of in hushed tones. Emily had been a young woman who lived in Seacliff many years ago. She was engaged to a sailor, a man she loved deeply, but one stormy night his ship was lost at sea, swallowed by the merciless waves. Emily, heartbroken, had thrown herself from the cliffs, her body claimed by the same sea that had taken her love. But her spirit didn't find peace. Instead, it was bound to the lighthouse, forever searching for her lost love, forever mourning what could never be. As Harold watched, Emily turned to face him. Her eyes were hollow, dark voids that seemed to pull him in. She opened her mouth to speak, but instead of words, a torrent of seawater gushed forth, soaking the floor and filling the room with the stench of salt and decay. Harold stumbled back, his lantern falling from his grasp and shattering on the stone floor. The light flickered out, plunging him into darkness. The sobbing continued, but now it was joined by other sounds, scratching like nails on wood, and a low, guttural moaning that seemed to come from the very walls. Harold tried to flee, but the darkness was disorienting, the sounds growing louder, closer. He could feel the cold seeping into his bones, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He turned to the staircase, but the way was blocked by shadowy figures, their forms shifting and writhing, their faces twisted in agony. In his panic, Harold stumbled through the door and found himself in a room he didn't recognize. It was small, cramped, and the walls were covered in a damp, moldy wallpaper. A single window looked out over the sea, but the view was distorted, as if through the veil of water. The room was empty except for an old, battered chest in the corner. Compelled by a force he couldn't resist, Harold approached the chest and opened it. Inside was a tangle of ropes, heavy with seawater, and a single piece of jewelry, a delicate locket on a silver chain. Harold picked up the locket, and as he did, a vision flashed before his eyes. He saw Emily, standing on the cliffs, the locket in her hand. He saw her open it, revealing a tiny portrait of her lost love. Then he saw her step off the edge, her face serene, as if she was finally joining him in the depths. The vision faded, and Harold was once again in the damp, dark room. But he wasn't alone. Emily stood before him, her eyes locked on the locket in his hand. For a moment there was silence, a stillness that felt like the calm before the storm. Then Emily reached out, her cold fingers brushing against Harold's, and he felt a pull, like the undertow of a strong current, dragging him down. The room began to spin, the walls closing in around him. The shadows grew darker, denser, until they were a tangible presence, pressing in on all sides. Harold tried to scream, but no sound came out. He was drowning, the air thick with seawater, his lungs burning as he gasped for breath. The last thing he saw before the darkness claimed was Emily's face, her expression one of sorrow and regret. When the storm finally passed, the townsfolk ventured up to the lighthouse, concerned for Harold's safety. They found the lantern room empty, the light extinguished. There was no sign of Harold, only a trail of wet footprints leading down the stairs and out to the cliffs. The villagers searched the shoreline, but all they found was an old, tarnished locket washed up on the rocks, its chain tangled in the seaweed. The lighthouse was abandoned after that, left to the elements and the ghosts that haunted its halls. The light was never relit, and ships began to avoid the treacherous waters of Seacliff, steering clear of the cursed lighthouse. But on stormy nights, when the wind howled and the waves crashed against the cliffs, the townsfolk would hear it, the distant sound of a woman's sobs, carried on the wind from the direction of the lighthouse. And those who dared to venture too close to the cliffs at night would swear they saw a figure standing at the edge, looking out to sea, waiting for something or someone who would never return. There are places in this world that exist in the spaces between reality and nightmare. Places that you can only find if you're not truly looking for them. They appear when the hour is late, when the world is quiet, and when the boundary between the living and the dead is at its thinnest. One such place is the midnight train, a spectral locomotive that rides the rails of forgotten tracks. It does not appear on any map, and no one ever speaks of it, but those who encounter it never forget. The midnight train is a gateway, a passageway to the darkest corners of your mind, a place where your deepest fears become reality. Clara had heard the stories, the whispered tales of a train that only appeared at midnight, its whistle echoing through the quiet streets of Ravenswood. The train was said to carry dreams to those who boarded it, but dreams are a double-edged sword. They can bring you joy, or they can bring you face to face with your worst nightmares. And Clara, restless and haunted by the memories she couldn't shake, was drawn to the midnight train like a moth to a flame. One cold, moonless night, unable to sleep, Clara found herself wandering the empty streets of her town. Her footsteps echoed on the cobblestones as she walked, her breath visible in the frigid air. She didn't know where she was going, she just walked, letting the night take her where it would. But as the clock struck midnight, she heard it, the distant sound of a train's whistle, low and mournful, cutting through the silence like a blade. Intrigued, Clara followed the sound, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never seen any train tracks in Ravenswood, yet the whistle seemed to be coming from just ahead. The fog rolled in thick, shrouding the street in a ghostly mist, and as Clara rounded a corner, she saw it, the midnight train. It was a black, hulking behemoth of iron and steam, its windows darkened and its engine belching smoke into the cold night air. The train seemed impossibly long, stretching into the mist, and as Clara approached, the doors of one of the carriages slid open with a hiss. Without thinking, she stepped inside, the door closing behind her with a final, metallic clank. The interior of the train was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of old leather and something else, something damp and earthy, like wet soil. The seats were worn, the upholstery faded, and the windows were so dirty that Clara could barely make out the landscape outside. But it wasn't the outside world that held her attention, it was the passengers. They were silent, motionless, their faces pale and gaunt, their eyes hollow. Some were dressed in clothes from another era, others in tattered rags, but all of them shared the same haunted expression, as if they had seen things no one should ever see. Clara hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to leave, but something stronger, some deep-seated need, pushed her forward. She moved down the aisle, her footsteps muffled by the threadbare carpet, and took a seat at the back of the carriage. The train lurched forward with a jolt, and Clara felt herself sinking into the seat, the dim light flickering above her. She looked around, but the other passengers didn't move, didn't even seem to notice her presence. The air grew colder, and the shadows in the carriage deepened, pressing in from all sides. Clara closed her eyes, trying to calm her racing heart, but the moment she did, the nightmare began. She was no longer on the train. She was in her childhood home, standing in the middle of the living room, surrounded by shadows. The room was just as she remembered it, familiar yet distorted, as if seen through a cracked mirror. The furniture was covered in dust, the windows boarded up, and the air was thick with the scent of decay. Clara knew this wasn't real, but it felt real. Too real. As she stood there, frozen in place, the shadows began to move. They slithered across the floor, crawling up the walls, their shapes shifting and changing, forming twisted figures that seemed to mock her fear. A sense of dread washed over her as she realized where she was. This was the place where her mother had died, where she had found her, lifeless and cold, her eyes staring into nothingness. Clara tried to move, but her feet wouldn't obey. The shadows grew larger, their forms more distinct, until they towered over her, whispering her name in voices that were not human. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The shadows closed in, their hands reaching out to drag her down into the darkness. But just as the nightmare threatened to consume her, the train jolted again, and she was back in the carriage, gasping for breath, her heart pounding in her chest. The passengers were still there, still motionless, but something had changed. Their eyes, once hollow and empty, were now fixed on her, watching her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. She could feel their silent judgment, their knowledge of the nightmare she had just endured. The train continued on, the landscape outside growing more and more distorted, twisted into the grotesque shape that defied explanation. Clara realized with growing horror that the train wasn't taking her to any physical destination. It was taking her deeper into her own mind, into the darkest recesses of her soul, where her deepest fears and regrets lay hidden. She tried to get up, to escape the train, but her body felt heavy, as if weighed down by an invisible force. The carriage seemed to stretch out before her, the exit impossibly far away. The whispers started again, soft at first, but growing louder, more insistent, until they were all she could hear. They spoke of things she had tried to forget, of memories she had buried deep, and of the guilt that gnawed at her at every waking moment. And then, as if in response to her rising panic, the train began to change. The walls closed in, the ceiling lowered, and the seats warped into twisted, nightmarish shapes. The passengers dissolved into shadows, their forms merging with the darkness that now filled the carriage. Clara felt herself sinking into the seat, the fabric closing around her like a cocoon, trapping her in place. She struggled, fought against the oppressive darkness, but it was no use. The train had her now, and it wasn't going to let her go. The whisper turned into screams, the shadow closed in, and Clara realized with a sinking dread that she would never leave this place. The midnight train was her prison, her punishment, a place where she would be forced to relive her worst fears over and over again for all eternity. And so, the midnight train continued its journey, riding the rails of forgotten tracks, its whistle echoing through the night. The passengers remained silent, their eyes hollow, their faces gaunt, waiting for the next lost soul to board. The train never stopped, never slowed, its destination unknown, its purpose clear, to take you to the darkest corners of your mind and leave you there, alone and afraid, with nothing but your nightmares for company. And somewhere, deep within the twisted corridors of the train, Clara sat, her eyes vacant, her soul trapped in an endless cycle of terror and despair. The midnight train had claimed her, just as it had claimed so many others before, and it would continue to ride the rails, searching for its next victim, its next passenger, its next prisoner. There are places that hold on to memories, places where the past and present merge in ways that defy explanation. Behind an old, crumbling manor on the outskirts of the village of Willowbrook lies such a place, a garden that only comes to life under the full moon. The villagers speak of it in hushed tones, warning their children to stay away, but the stories have a way of luring the curious, the brave, and the foolish into its grasp. The Moonlit Garden is beautiful, yes, but it is also dangerous, a place where the shadows are deep and the spirits of the past walk among the living. The manor had stood for centuries, its one grand facade now crumbling and overtaken by ivy and decay. No one had lived there for as long as anyone could remember, and the villagers avoided it, fearing the stories of ghosts that haunted its halls. But what truly frightened them wasn't the manor itself, it was the garden that lay behind it, hidden from view by tall, wrought iron gates and overgrown hedges. They called it the Moonlit Garden because, under the light of the full moon, it would come alive in ways that no one could explain. Flowers would bloom in colors not seen in daylight, the air would be filled with the sweet scent of night-blooming jasmine, and the shadows would move on their own, as if they were alive. Sophie had always been drawn to the manor, ever since she was a child. There was something about its desolate beauty, its forgotten grandeur, that called to her. The stories didn't scare her, they intrigued her. So on the night of the full moon, when the village was quiet and the world was bathed in silver light, Sophie decided to explore the Moonlit Garden for herself. She slipped through the rusted gates, the iron creaking softly in the night air, and stepped into the garden. The moment she crossed the threshold, she felt it, a change in the air, a tingling on her skin, as if the garden itself was aware of her presence. The moon hung low in the sky, its light casting the long, eerie shadows across the ground. The garden was overgrown, wild with untamed beauty. Vines twisted around ancient statues, and flowers of every shape and color bloomed in tangled profusion. The air was thick with the scent of roses and something else, something darker and more intoxicating. Sophie walked deeper into the garden, her footsteps silent on the soft earth, her heart beating faster with every step. As she ventured further, the shadows grew longer, stretching out towards her like dark tendrils. The garden seemed to shift and change around her, the paths twisting in ways that didn't make sense. She found herself standing before a large oak tree at the center of the garden. Its gnarled branches reached out like skeletal fingers. The tree was ancient, its bark rough and twisted, and at its base there was a stone bench, half buried in the earth. Sophie sat down on the bench, feeling the cold stone beneath her, and looked up at the tree. The moonlight filtered through the leaves, casting intricate patterns of light and shadow on the ground. She felt a sense of peace, as if the garden was welcoming her, inviting her to stay. But as the minute passed, the air grew colder, and the shadows began to move. At first, it was subtle, a flicker of movement out of the corner of her eye, a rustle of leaves where there was no wind. But then, the shadows began to take shape, forming figures that danced and swayed in the moonlight. Sophie watched, mesmerized, as the shadows of the people long gone began to appear, their forms translucent and ghostly, their faces lost to time. They were spirits of those who had lived in the manor, bound to the garden by an ancient curse. They moved silently, their footsteps making no sound, their eyes empty and hollow. One of them, a young woman with long, flowing hair, approached Sophie, her face filled with sorrow. Sophie felt a chill run down her spine as the woman reached out to her, her hand cold as ice. The woman spoke, her voice a whisper carried on the wind. "We are trapped here, bound to the garden by the sins of our past. We cannot leave, but you can." Sophie tried to move, to get up from the bench, but she found herself unable to. The shadows closed in around her, their forms becoming more solid, more real. The air grew colder, and the garden, once beautiful and inviting, now felt oppressive, suffocating. She could feel the weight of the spirits pressing down on her, pulling her into their world. The young woman's face twisted in anguish, and she reached out again, her hand grasping Sophie's arm with a strength that belied her ghostly form. "You must leave," she urged, her voice filled with desperation, "before it's too late." Sophie struggled to break free, her heart pounding in her chest. The shadows were all around her now, their faces twisted and grotesque, their hands clawing at her, pulling her down. She felt herself sinking into the ground, the earth swallowing her up, the garden closing in around her. With a final burst of strength, Sophie tore herself away from the spirits and ran. She fled through the garden, the path twisting and turning in ways that made no sense, the shadows chasing her, the whispers filling her ears. She reached the gate, flung it open, and stumbled onto the street, gasping for breath, her heart racing. The garden was silent again, the shadows gone, the spirits vanished. The moon still hung low in the sky, its light now cold and distant. Sophie looked back at the manor, its windows dark and empty, and she knew she had narrowly escaped a fate worse than death. The villagers found her the next morning, wandering the streets, her clothes torn and her eyes wide with fear. She told them what had happened, but they only shook their heads, whispering among themselves. They had all heard the stories, after all. They knew what the Moonlit Garden was capable of. And so, the garden remains, hidden behind the gates of an old manor, waiting for the next curious soul to wander too close. Because once you enter the Moonlit Garden, you may never leave. The spirits are always there, watching, waiting, bound to the garden by the sins of their past, and if you're not careful, you might just join them. The town of Harrow's End was no stranger to strange occurrences, but nothing had ever been as unsettling as the arrival of the Silent Ones. It began with whispers. Rumors passed from one neighbor to the next about the eerie figures who had been seen at night, standing at the edge of the woods. They never moved, never spoke. They just watched. People claimed that they saw them standing in their yards or on the outskirts of town, always just far enough away to be barely noticeable. But what was most disturbing was the complete and utter silence that followed them. Birds would stop chirping, the wind would cease, and even the sounds of your own breath seemed to disappear when the Silent Ones were near. At first, they appeared only sporadically, and only a few people claimed to have seen them. But as the nights grew longer, more and more of the townspeople began to notice the strange, pale figures lingering at the edge of the shadows, watching and waiting. Tom was one of the first to confront the Silent Ones. A local farmer, he had heard the stories but dismissed them as nonsense. One night, while walking back from the barn, he noticed a figure standing in his field. Tall, thin, and barely visible in the dim light of the moon, the figure was completely still, facing his house. Annoyed, Tom marched towards it, calling out for the trespasser to leave his property. But as he approached, the air grew cold, and the usual nighttime sounds of crickets and owls fell silent. A thick, oppressive stillness settled over the field. Tom's voice died in his throat as he realized that no sound was escaping his lips. The figure remained motionless, its face obscured by shadows. Panicking, Tom stumbled backward, the silence pressing in on him from all sides. He turned and ran back to his house, the figure never moving, but its presence lingering in his mind like a dark stain. When he reached his front door, he slammed it shut behind him, but the silence followed him inside. His wife, Sarah, found him hours later, sitting in the living room, trembling and unable to speak. The next day, the town was abuzz with stories of other sightings. People claimed to have seen the silent ones standing by their windows, at the end of their driveways, or watching them from across the street. The figures were always the same, tall, gaunt, and silent, their faces never fully visible. It wasn't long before the disappearances began. One by one, people vanished from their homes without a trace. No signs of struggle, no footprints, no sounds. They were simply gone. Families would wake up to find empty beds, their loved ones missing, with no explanation for how or why. The only clue was the lingering silence that seemed to seep into every corner of their homes. In a desperate attempt to understand what was happening, a group of townspeople decided to follow one of the silent ones. They waited until nightfall, when the figures appeared once more at the edge of the woods. Armed with flashlights and a sense of grim determination, they followed the silent ones as they retreated into the forest. The deeper they went, the quieter it became. The crunch of leaves underfoot vanished, their breathing became soundless, and even the wind in the trees seemed to disappear. Soon, they found themselves standing in a clearing, surrounded by the silent ones, who had formed a circle around them. The townspeople tried to speak, but no words came. Panic set in as they realized they had walked right into a trap. The silent ones began to move for the first time, slowly closing the circle around them. Their faces, once hidden in shadow, were now visible, pale, featureless, and void of any humanity. One by one, the townspeople felt the oppressive weight of the silence pulling them down. They couldn't scream, couldn't run. The last thing they saw before the darkness took them was the expressionless face of the silent ones, their cold, lifeless eyes staring into their very souls. By morning, the group was gone, just like the others before them. Their homes were empty, their names forgotten. The only thing left behind was the silence, thick and unnatural, seeping into the town like a plague. And with each passing night, the silent ones crept closer, their numbers growing. Now, in Harrow's End, the silence is a warning, a final, deadly warning. And if you ever hear the silence in the dead of night, pray it passes over you, because once the silent ones have chosen you, there's no escape. Jacob first saw the Shadow Man when he was 8 years old, and from that moment, his life was never the same. It happened late one night, long after his parents had gone to bed. He had slipped out of bed, sneaking downstairs for a drink of water. The house was silent, the kind of stillness that makes every small sound echo, and the only light came from the moon, filtering through the living room window. As Jacob padded softly down the hallway, something in the far corner of the room caught his eye. A man stood there, unnaturally still. Jacob froze mid-step, his breath catching in his throat. The figure was tall, too tall, and his limbs seemed too long, like something barely human, stretched out to fit a human shape. His face was hidden in shadow, and even though Jacob couldn't see his eyes, he knew the figure was watching him. There was something wrong about the man, something that made Jacob's skin crawl. The figure seemed to absorb the light around him, casting no shadow of his own, and the air felt heavy, thick with something Jacob didn't understand but instinctively feared. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Jacob stood rooted to the spot, his heart pounding in his chest, while the figure remained perfectly still, like a statue carved from darkness itself. He blinked once, and the man was gone. Shaken, Jacob ran back to his room, pulling the covers over his head and telling himself that it was just his imagination. But even as he tried to convince himself that the Shadow Man wasn't real, he knew deep down that something had changed that night. He never told his parents, never told anyone, but he could feel the presence of the man lurking in the corners of his life, always just out of sight, always watching. Years passed, and Jacob learned to ignore the brief glimpses he caught of the Shadow Man. He would see him reflected in the glass of a window or in the flicker of a streetlight at dusk, always watching, always waiting. The figure never moved, never spoke, but Jacob could feel the weight of his gaze wherever he went. It wasn't until Jacob turned 24 that things began to shift. By then, he had become accustomed to the eerie presence, so much so that it had become a part of his life, something that he tolerated like a permanent shadow. But the sightings became more frequent. The Shadow Man was no longer content to linger in the edges of his vision. He began appearing more directly. One evening, after a particularly long day at work, Jacob was sitting in his apartment, watching TV, when he felt it, a cold, prickling sensation creeping up the back of his neck. He knew what it was before he even turned around. Slowly, his breath shallow, he glanced over his shoulder. The Shadow Man stood in the corner of the room. This time, the figure was closer than he had ever been before, just a few feet away, looming in the darkened corner of the living room. Jacob could make out the faint outlines of a face. No eyes, no features, just a blank, expressionless void where a human face should have been. His heart raced, a wave of nausea washing over him as he stared at the figure. The figure remained motionless, silent as ever, but this time was different. This time, Jacob could feel something pulling at him, a weight pressing down on his chest, making it hard to breathe. The air around him felt thicker, colder, like the very room was suffocating him. Without thinking, Jacob leaped from the couch and ran for the door, his panic rising with each step. He didn't look back as he grabbed his keys and fled the apartment, his pulse pounding in his ears. When he finally stopped running, he was standing outside, breathless and trembling, the cold night air biting at his skin. He had no idea where he was going. He just knew that he had to get away from that thing, from the Shadow Man. But no matter how far Jacob ran, he couldn't escape the feeling that he was being followed. The presence of the Shadow Man clung to him, like a stain that couldn't be washed away. Every time he stopped, every time he turned a corner, he expected to see the figure waiting for him, and he was always there. Weeks passed, and Jacob's life spiraled into paranoia. He avoided mirrors, refused to turn off the lights, and barely slept. Every night he would lie in bed, eyes wide open, waiting for the inevitable moment when the Shadow Man would appear at the foot of his bed. But the more he tried to run from the figure, the closer it seemed to get. One night, exhausted and terrified, Jacob made the mistake of confronting him. It was nearly 3 a.m. when Jacob woke to the sound of his apartment door creaking open. His heart dropped as he realized what was happening. Slowly, the door swung wide, and there, standing in the hallway, was the Shadow Man. He was no longer just a distant figure lingering in the corners. He was here, in Jacob's home, stepping slowly, deliberately toward him. Jacob sat up in bed, his entire body trembling. "What do you want from me?" he shouted, his voice cracking. The figure stopped at the edge of the bed, towering over him, its form impossibly dark. For the first time, it moved. Slowly, it bent down, bringing its featureless face inches from Jacob's. Cold air swirled around him, and for a moment, Jacob thought he heard something, a whisper, faint and far away, like wind rushing through a distant cave. Then the Shadow Man straightened up and turned away, fading into the darkness once more. Jacob sat there, frozen, the adrenaline still coursing through his veins, but the figure was gone, leaving behind only the crushing silence. He never saw the Shadow Man again after that night, but the fear never left him, because he knew the truth. Once the Shadow Man chooses you, you're never truly free. You may not see him again, but you'll always know he's there, lurking just beyond the edge of the light, waiting for the moment you forget, and he'll return when you least expect it. The old house at the end of the street had always been abandoned, or so everyone thought. You'd walk past it 100 times, its windows dark and empty, the paint peeling from the walls, the porch sagging under the weight of years. No one in the neighborhood talked about it, and those who did never had anything good to say. It was just there, a fixture of decay, as though it had been forgotten by the world. One evening, after a particularly long day, you found yourself walking home later than usual. The sun had set, and a thick fog had rolled in, making the familiar street feel strange and eerie. As you passed by the old house, something caught your eye. It was faint, just a flicker of movement in one of the upstairs windows. You stopped, squinting through the fog. The house had always been dark, lifeless, but now there was a dim, flickering light coming from one of the upper windows. You stood there, staring, your breath catching in your throat. For a moment, you thought it must be your imagination, but then you saw it again. A shadow, moving behind the window. Your heart skipped a beat. No one lived there. No one had lived there for years. You could feel the hairs on the back of your neck stand on end as the shadow moved again, slowly, deliberately, as if it knew you were watching. You tried to convince yourself it was just a trick of the light, maybe the reflection of a passing car, but the street was empty. There was no one around, no sound except the soft rustling of the wind through the trees. And then the shadow stopped. It stood there, perfectly still, right in front of the window. You could feel its eyes on you, even though you couldn't see a face, just the dark silhouette of something or someone watching you. You took a step back, your heart racing. You weren't sure what to do. Part of you wanted to turn and run, but another part of you, an uneasy curiosity, kept you rooted onto the spot. You stood there, frozen, staring up at the window, waiting for something to happen. And then slowly, the light in the windows went out. The shadow disappeared, swallowed by the darkness of the house. You blinked, your mind struggling to make sense of what you'd just seen. For a long moment, you stood there in the fog, staring at the now dark window, half expecting the shadow to reappear. But it didn't. Finally, you shook yourself from the trance and hurried home, telling yourself it was just a trick of the light, that your mind had been playing tricks on you after a long day, but deep down, you knew something wasn't right. That night, you couldn't sleep. Every time you closed your eyes, you saw the shadow in the window. You could feel its gaze, cold and distant, as though it was still watching you, waiting for you to come closer. The house had always been empty, hadn't it? No one had lived there for as long as you could remember, but now, something was there. The next morning, you couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over you. The house at the end of the street loomed in your thoughts, its dark windows staring back at you whenever you closed your eyes. You tried to ignore it, go about your day as usual, but the thought of the shadow in the window clung to you like a dark cloud. That evening, as you walked home again, you found yourself glancing toward the house. The fog had returned, thick and heavy, and the streetlights barely cut through the gloom. You quickened your pace, your breath coming in shallow gasps as you approached the house. And then you saw it again, the light in the upstairs window. Your heart raced as you stared at the house, the same dim, flickering light coming from the same window. The shadow was there again, moving slowly behind the glass, just as it had the night before. But this time, it didn't stop at the window. It moved closer. You took a step back, your blood running cold as the shadow seemed to approach the glass, its dark form growing larger, more defined. You could feel the weight of its gaze, heavy and oppressive, as though it was drawing you in. And then it reached out. A hand, pale, thin, and unnaturally long, pressed against the glass, leaving a faint, smudged outline on the window. Your heart pounded in your chest as you watched, frozen in place, unable to tear your eyes away. The hand moved slowly, its fingers tapping gently against the glass, as though beckoning you closer. You turned and ran. You didn't stop until you were safely inside your house, the door locked behind you, your heart still racing in your chest. You stood there for a long time, your back pressed against the door, listening to the sound of your own breathing, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But the night was silent. The next morning you told yourself it was over, that you wouldn't go near that house again. But as the day wore on, the memory of the shadow in the window gnawed at you, pulling at the edges of your mind. You had to know what was inside. That evening, just as the sun was setting, You found yourself standing in front of the old house. The fog was thicker than ever, and the street was eerily quiet. You hesitated at the gate, your heart pounding in your chest, but the pull was too strong. You stepped inside. The front door was unlocked. The house was dark, the air inside cold and stale. You moved slowly through the rooms, your footsteps echoing in the silence. Every creak on the floorboards sent a shiver down your spine, but you pressed on, making your way upstairs. The door to the room with the window was slightly ajar. You pushed it open. The room was empty. No furniture, no decorations, just bare walls and a single window, cracked and dirty. The light outside was fading fast, casting long shadows across the floor. And then you saw it. On the glass, faint but unmistakable, was the outline of a hand pressed against the window, just as it had been the night before. Behind you, the floor creaked. You've lived alone for years, in this quiet house at the end of a long, narrow street. It's peaceful, you'd always thought, the kind of house where you can shut out the world. But lately, something has been happening. Every night at exactly 3:13 a.m., you wake up to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. At first you thought it was just the house settling, but the footsteps are deliberate, slow, like someone pacing just outside your bedroom door. The first night, you didn't think much of it, just a creaky old house playing tricks on your mind. But the next night, it happened again. The same time, the same slow, measured footsteps. But each time you tried to dismiss it, you found it harder to convince yourself. By the third night, you were awake before 3:13 a.m., lying in bed, waiting for it to happen. And it did. The soft, steady sound of footsteps in the hall. It was closer this time. The door handle rattled slightly, just once, but didn't turn. You stayed still, heart pounding, staring at the ceiling and praying the noise would stop. When morning came, you told yourself it was nothing, maybe a draft or something wrong with the house's foundation, but deep down, you knew this wasn't true. Night after night, it continued, always at 3:13 a.m. The footsteps, the rattling door handle, and a strange, oppressive silence afterward, as though something, or someone, was waiting just on the other side. You tried locking the door, but it didn't make a difference. The footsteps just came the same, and the handle rattled with a new kind of urgency, as though it knew the door was locked and was testing it. One night, you decided to stay awake to see if you could catch whatever was causing the noise. You sat in the corner of the room, holding your phone in trembling hands, the minutes ticking by you as you stared at the door. The house was dead silent, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're being swallowed by it. Your eyes stayed fixed on the clock, waiting for 3:13 a.m. When the time finally came, your breath hitched in your throat. The sound of footsteps started, slow and methodical, growing louder with each passing second. You held your breath as the steps stopped just outside your door. The handle rattled, harder this time, as if whoever, or whatever, was behind it was growing frustrated. Then it stopped. You stayed there, frozen, barely daring to breathe. The silence dragged on, long enough that you almost convinced yourself it was over, that maybe the house was done playing its cruel tricks. But then you heard it, the sound of something brushing against the door, like fingers sliding across the wood. Soft, deliberate, slow. You jumped to your feet, heart pounding so hard that you thought it would burst out of your chest. Your phone slipped from your hand, clattering to the floor, but you didn't dare reach down to pick it up. Instead, you moved slowly toward the door, your pulse thundering in your ears as you strained to listen for any other sounds. For the first time, you felt like it was waiting for you. With trembling fingers, you reached for the door handle. It was cool to the touch, and for a moment, you hesitated. You could feel something, someone, on the other side, standing just as still as you, waiting for the door to open. Your mind raced, imagining what you might see, a shadowy figure, a pale face pressed against the wood, or worse, nothing at all. But before you could turn the handle, the door rattled violently. You stumbled back, fear surging through your body like ice. The door shook again, as if something was slamming into it, trying desperately to get in. You scrambled back toward the bed, grabbing your phone and dialing the police in the frenzy. The phone rang, but there was no answer, just silence, a void on the other end of the line. Your heart raced as the pounding on the door grew louder, more insistent. The wood groaned under the pressure, and for a moment you thought the door would give way. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The air grew still, the silence was suffocating. You didn't move, you didn't dare. After what felt like hours, you finally mustered the courage to move toward the door again. You pressed your ear against it, listening for any signs of movement, but there was nothing, just the sound of your own ragged breathing. You stayed there, pressed against the door, until the first light of dawn broke through the window. When you finally opened the door, the hallway was empty, as though nothing had ever been there. But you knew better. Something had been in your house. Something had tried to get in. And it wasn't finished. The next night, the footsteps returned at exactly 3:13 a.m., slower this time, as if whatever it was knew you were listening. You didn't move from the bed. You didn't dare open the door. But you knew, deep down, that it was only a matter of time before it found a way in. Because the next morning, when you went to check the door, you noticed something new. Scratches, deep and jagged, carved into the wood around the door handle. Whatever it was getting impatient. There was an old well in the woods behind your house, a relic from a time when the town was just a small settlement. The well had long since gone dry, and now it was little more than a forgotten landmark, overgrown with ivy and surrounded by weeds. As a child, you'd always been warned to stay away from it, not just because it was dangerous, but because of the stories. Everyone in town knew the stories about the well. It was said that, long ago, a young woman had fallen into it, never to be seen again. Some said it was an accident, others whispered that she had been pushed, but no one could agree on how or why she had disappeared. Her body was never recovered, and since then, people have claimed to hear strange noises coming from the well. Whispers, soft crying, even faint laughter at night. You hadn't thought about the well in years, but one autumn afternoon, while walking through the woods, you stumbled across it again. The sight of it sent a shiver down your spine, though you didn't know why. It was just an old well, after all, a piece of history that had been left behind as the town grew. But as you stood there, staring at the overgrown stones, you heard it, a soft voice, barely a whisper, drifting up from the darkness below. "Help me." You froze, your heart pounding in your chest. The voice was faint, almost fragile, as though it were coming from a great distance. For a moment, you thought that you must be imagining it, that your mind was playing tricks on you. But then you heard it again, a little louder this time. "Please, help me." Against your better judgment, you stepped closer to the well, peering into its dark depths. The inside was black, the bottom lost to the shadows. You couldn't see anything, but the voice continued, soft and pleading. "I've been down here so long. Please help me." Your heart raced. The voice sounded so real, so desperate, and you found yourself wondering if it could be true. Could someone be down there, trapped for all these years? But that didn't make sense. How could anyone survive down there for so long? You shook your head, telling yourself it was impossible, just the wind playing tricks on your ears. You turned to leave, but then something else caught your eye. A face. You spun back to the well, your breath catching in your throat. There, just barely visible in the shadows, was the pale outline of a face staring up at you from the darkness. The eyes were wide, hollow, and empty, and the mouth was twisted into a sorrowful smile. "Please, don't leave me." You stumbled back, your heart hammering in your chest. The face didn't move, but the voice continued, growing softer now, more insistent. "I'm so lonely. Please, Help me. You ran. You didn't stop until you were back at your house, the door locked behind you, your body trembling with fear. You told yourself it wasn't real, that you'd imagined it all. But the memory of the face in the well lingered in your mind, haunting you long after you'd left the woods. That night, you couldn't sleep. Every time you closed your eyes, you saw the face again, staring up at you from the darkness, its hollow eyes pleading for help. The voice echoed in your mind, soft and desperate, until you couldn't take it anymore. The next morning, you went back to the well. The woods were quiet, the air still. You stood at the edge of the well, staring down into the shadows. For a long moment, there was nothing. No voice, no face, just silence. And then faintly, you heard it again. Please, help me. You hesitated, your heart racing. This time, the voice sounded weaker, more fragile, as though it were fading away. You couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, that if you didn't act now, it would be too late. Before you could stop yourself, you reached for the old rope that still hung from the side of the well. It was frayed and covered in moss, but it seemed strong enough to hold your weight. You lowered yourself into the well, the rope creaking under the strain as you descended into the darkness. The air grew colder as you went deeper, the light above fading until you were surrounded by nothing but shadows. The walls were damp and covered in slime, and the smell of earth and decay filled your nostrils. You tried not to think about the stories, about the woman who had disappeared so many years ago. You told yourself it was just an old well, that there was nothing to be afraid of. But then you reached the bottom. The ground was wet and slick beneath your feet, and the darkness was so thick you could barely see. You shone your flashlight around, searching for any sign of the voice, the face you'd seen before. But there was nothing, just cold, damp stone. And then, from behind you, came a soft whisper, "Thank you for coming." You spun around, your flashlight flickering. There, standing just a few feet away, was the figure of a woman. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were hollow, dark pits. She smiled at you, her lips cracking as she spoke. "I've been waiting for so long." You tried to back away, but your feet wouldn't move. The woman took a step closer, her smile widening as she reached out towards you with thin, bony fingers. "Now you can take my place." It started with small things. Your roommate, Hannah, getting up in the middle of the night to grab a glass of water or use the bathroom. You'd hear footsteps shuffling around the apartment, but it wasn't anything strange at first. Everyone gets up in the middle of the night sometimes, but then her nightly wanderings became more frequent. One night, you woke up to the sound of her pacing in the hallway outside your bedroom. The sound of her bare feet on the floor was slow, methodical, as though she was walking in circles. You checked the clock, 3:32 a.m. Groggily, you called out, "Hannah, you okay?" No answer. Annoyed, you got up, opened the door, and found her standing there in the middle of the hallway, staring straight ahead. Her eyes were open but glazed over, like she was asleep with her eyes open. You called her name again, but she didn't respond. She just turned and walked back toward her room in that same slow, robotic way. You chalked it up to sleepwalking. When you brought it up the next morning, she laughed it off. "I've never sleepwalked before," she said, shrugging it off as a fluke. "I must have just been stressed or something." But the next night, it happened again. This time, you found her in the kitchen, standing in front of the sink, staring out the window into the dark backyard. When you spoke to her, she didn't react. She just stood there, hands resting on the counter, her eyes vacant. You guided her back to her room, trying to shake off that eerie feeling that clung to you long after you crawled back into bed. The nights went on like this. Each time, she seemed to walk a little longer, wander a little farther. You found her in the living room, in the bathroom, once even standing by the front door, her hand on the doorknob as if she was about to leave. But it was the way she moved that unsettled you the most. So slow, deliberate, like she was searching for something. One night, you heard her again, this time at the foot of your bed. Your eyes snapped open, and there she was, standing in the darkness, watching you. Her face was blank, her eyes open but seeing nothing. A chill ran down your spine, and you had to suppress the urge to scream. You sat up slowly, whispering her name, but she didn't respond. She just turned and left the room, walking back down the hallway like nothing had happened. The next morning, you confronted her about it. "Hannah, you were in my room last night," you said, trying to keep your voice steady. "Do you remember?" She frowned, shaking her head. "I don't remember anything. I must have been sleepwalking again." But there was something in her expression, a flicker of doubt, of unease. She wasn't laughing it off anymore. She was just as disturbed by it as you were. That night, you decided to stay up and keep watch. You sat in the living room, lights off, waiting for Hannah to start her nightly wandering. The apartment was quiet, the only sound the ticking of the clock on the wall. You told yourself it was just a phase, something she'd snap out of eventually. But deep down, you couldn't shake this feeling that something was wrong, very wrong. It was almost 3 a.m. when you heard it, the soft creak of her bedroom door opening. You watched from your seat as Hannah stepped into the hallway, moving with the same slow, deliberate pace. But this time, something was different. She wasn't just wandering aimlessly. She was walking with purpose, heading towards the front door. You stood up, calling her name softly. "Hannah?" She didn't stop. She reached the door, her hand curling around the doorknob. Before you could stop her, she turned the knob and opened the door. The cold night air rushed into the apartment, sending a shiver down your spine. You hurried toward her, grabbing her arm gently but firmly. "Hannah, you can't go outside," you said, trying to guide her back inside. But she didn't budge. She stared straight ahead, as if she couldn't hear you, as if you weren't even there. You felt a growing panic as she pulled away from you, stepping over the threshold and into the yard. "Where are you going?" you whispered, more to yourself than to her. She didn't answer, of course. She just kept walking. You followed her, unsure of what else to do, your bare feet crunching on the gravel as she made her way down the driveway and out into the street. And then she stopped. In the middle of the road, under the dim glow of a street lamp, she stood still, staring off into the distance. You hurried to catch up, grabbing her by the shoulders and shaking her gently. "Hannah, snap out of it." For a moment, she blinked, her eyes fluttering as she was waking up from a deep sleep. She looked around, confused, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Where am I?" she muttered, her voice shaky. "You were sleepwalking again," you said, your voice tight with concern. "I followed you out here. You were going to leave the house." She stared at you, wide-eyed, the realization slowly dawning on her. She was terrified, just like you. Together, you walked back to the house in silence, both of you shaken by what had happened. But as you climbed the stairs to your apartment, you couldn't help but glance back over your shoulder. Something about this didn't feel right. It wasn't just sleepwalking anymore. It felt like she was being pulled, like something was leading her. That night, you locked all the doors, double-checked the windows, and lay in bed, waiting for the sound of her footsteps. You told yourself it wouldn't happen again, that maybe this was the last time. But when 3 a.m. rolled around, you heard it again, her door creaking open, her soft footsteps padding down the hall. You held your breath, your heart pounding in your chest, and then the footsteps stopped, right outside your bedroom door. You waited for her to leave, to go back to her room like she always did, but she didn't. She stood there, motionless. You could hear her breathing, slow and steady, just inches away from you. And then, slowly, the door began to open. When the door creaked wide enough, you saw her standing there, eyes open, staring straight ahead. But this time, something was different. Her eyes weren't blank anymore. There was something behind them, something dark, something aware. She smiled, and in that moment you realized it wasn't Hannah anymore. It was a strange thing to inherit. When your great-aunt passed away, everyone expected the usual: old furniture, dusty antiques, maybe a few family heirlooms. But no one had anticipated the mirror. It had been hidden away in her attic for decades, covered with an old sheet, almost forgotten by the family, until you received the letter. She had left the mirror to you specifically. At first, you didn't think much of it. The mirror was tall, framed in dark wood, intricately carved with symbols and patterns you didn't recognize. Its surface was perfectly smooth, reflecting the room with eerie clarity. There was something unsettling about the way it caught the light, almost as if it absorbed more than it reflected. Still, you placed it in the corner of your bedroom. It was just a mirror, after all. What harm could it do? The first few nights, everything seemed normal. You went about your routines, occasionally catching your reflection in the mirror as you passed by. But as the day wore on, you began to notice something odd. Your reflection wasn't quite right. It was subtle at first, a slight delay when you moved, a flicker of something in the background that wasn't really there. You brushed it off, telling yourself it was just your mind playing tricks on you, but then it got worse. One evening, as you sat in front of the mirror brushing your hair, you noticed it again. Your reflection was moving out of sync with you. It raised its arm a fraction of a second after you did, its eyes flickering with an intensity that sent a shiver down your spine. You froze, staring at the glass. The reflection didn't. It continued brushing its hair, slowly, deliberately, even as you sat there motionless. You backed away from the mirror, your heart pounding in your chest. This couldn't be happening. It was impossible. But there it was, your reflection, moving on its own, staring back at you with the eyes that didn't belong to you anymore. You left the room that night, telling yourself you'd deal with it in the morning. But as you lay in bed, you couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching you. You kept your eyes tightly shut, trying to block out the fear creeping into your mind. The next day, you covered the mirror with a sheet, but the unease remained. A few nights later, you woke in the middle of the night. The house was silent, but something had pulled you from sleep, a feeling deep in your gut that something was wrong. You sat up, your eyes adjusting to the darkness. The sheet that had covered the mirror was on the floor. You stared at the uncovered glass, your pulse quickening. You hadn't touched it, had you? But there it was, the mirror fully exposed, reflecting the room in the dim light. You slowly climbed out of bed, your feet cold against the floor, and stepped closer to the mirror. Your reflection stared back at you, perfectly still. You exhaled, relieved. Maybe it had just slipped off, you thought. Maybe it was nothing. But as you turned to go back to bed, something caught your eye. The reflection didn't turn with you. Your breath caught in your throat as you slowly turned back to face the mirror. Your reflection stood there, facing you, its eyes wide and cold. It smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that didn't reach its eyes. And then, without warning, it stepped out of the mirror. The air grew impossibly cold as your reflection stood in front of you, towering over you with that twisted smile. You backed away, your heart racing, but it followed, its movements smooth and unnatural, like a marionette being pulled by invisible strings. You stumbled, falling to the floor as it loomed over you, its smile stretching wider, its eyes gleaming with something dark, something hungry. "You should have left me alone," it whispered, its voice barely more than a hiss, and then it bent down, reaching for you with hands that no longer felt like your own. The old Belmont mansion had been abandoned for as long as anyone could remember, its once grand walls now overgrown with ivy and shadows. Every local knew the stories, whispers of strange happenings, eerie sounds at night, and the chilling toll of a bell that no one could locate. No one dared enter, not even the bravest of thrill-seekers, because of one particular tale that had rooted itself deep in the town's lore. It was said that, over a century ago, the mansion had been home to a wealthy family. They lived in luxury until a terrible storm ravaged the town. The river, normally a calm stream at the base of the hill, swelled into a furious flood, sweeping away homes and lives. The Belmonts, isolated on their hill, heard the church bell ring out for help, but they never answered. They stayed safe behind their heavy oak doors, ignoring the cries of their fellow townspeople. That night, it said that the waters carried more than debris. Something malevolent awoke, and by morning the Belmont family was never seen again. No one knows exactly what happened to them, but ever since, the sound of a distant bell could be heard from within the mansion's walls, tolling at midnight. The townspeople believed it to be a warning, a call to those who ignored suffering would be cursed to hear the bells toll forever. I'd heard the story plenty of times growing up, but I never believed it. I wasn't even from the town, really, just a visitor staying for a couple of weeks to clear my head. It was a small town, quaint enough to feel far away from the chaos of the city, and I thought a walk through the woods near the Belmont place might help me clear my mind. I hadn't planned on staying so late, but the deep woods have a way of messing with your sense of time. By the time I realized how dark it had become, the sky was a canvas of stars, and the only sound was the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. That's when I saw it, through the trees, the silhouette of the mansion, larger and closer than I expected. I stood there, staring at the decrepit structure. It was eerie, yes, but in a way that made you want to get closer, to satisfy that gnawing curiosity. So I did. The gate was unlocked, hanging on its rusted hinges. The garden beyond was wild, nature having reclaimed it long ago. I hesitated at the front steps, though I wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the weight of the silence, heavier than it had been in the woods, or maybe it was the feeling that something or someone was watching. I shook the thought away and pushed open the door. It groaned in protest, and inside the air was musty, filled with the scent of decay and time. The floorboards creaked underfoot, each step echoing through the empty hall. Dust swirled in the light of my flashlight, which flickered for a moment, casting strange shadows along the walls. There was nothing there, just old forgotten furniture and walls that seemed to groan with the weight of the past. I didn't feel scared, just a little foolish. Here I was, in the infamous Belmont mansion, and it was just an old, empty house. That was, until I heard it, the soft, distant toll of a bell. My heart skipped. It was faint but unmistakable, like the echo of something far away, calling through time. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It couldn't be real. The stories were just that, stories. But as the bell rang again, louder this time, my chest tightened. I turned to leave, my instincts finally catching up with me, but the door had shut, slowly, without a sound. Panic rose, but I forced myself to stay calm, to think logically. The wind, it had to be. Maybe I had imagined the bell, but as I took a step back, I heard it again, closer, louder. The sound reverberated through the empty mansion, growing with every second, shaking the walls like a heartbeat. I rushed to the door, pulling at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Cold sweat trickled down my back as the tolling grew deafening. It was everywhere now, rattling through the woods, shaking the floor beneath me. I could feel it inside my head, pulsing with an energy that didn't belong in this world. Then, suddenly, it stopped. Everything was silent again. No bell, no wind, nothing. Just the heavy, suffocating quiet of the mansion. I turned around, slowly this time, and my breath caught in my throat. Standing at the top of the grand staircase was a figure, cloaked in shadow. I couldn't make out its face, but I could feel its gaze, cold and ancient. I couldn't move, my feet glued to the floor as the figure descended the stairs, each step deliberate and slow, the air growing colder with each movement. When it reached the bottom, it paused, as if studying me. Then it pointed, slowly, toward the door. The handle rattled. The door, once stuck, creaked open on its own. I didn't need to be told twice. I bolted, stumbling into the night, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind me, the mansion loomed, silent and still once more. But as I crossed the threshold of the gate, I heard the bell toll one last time. I never went back, never told anyone what happened that night, but sometimes, when I'm alone, I still hear the distant echo of that bell ringing in the dead of night as if calling me back. But I won't answer. I know better now. In the heart of a small, forgotten town stood an ancient clock shop, long abandoned and covered in dust. The storefront was dark, its windows thick with grime, and the name Garrett's Clocks and Timepieces barely legible beneath years of neglect. The building seemed frozen in time, much like the clocks within it, their hands forever stopped at strange, random hours. For decades, no one had dared to enter. Locals avoided the place, crossing the street when they walked past, speaking of it only in whispers. They called it cursed, though no one knew the full story of why. Some said old Mr. Garrett had gone mad. Others claimed the clocks had driven him to it. Molly didn't believe in curses or haunted shops. She had moved to the town for a quiet life, far from the noise of the city. She had heard the rumors about the clock shop, but to her, it was just another run-down building in need of repair. An eyesore that might, with some effort, be restored to its former charm. Curiosity got the better of her one evening as she passed by the shop on her way home. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the street. She paused, staring at the faded sign, her eyes drifting to the darkened interior through a small crack in the window. It wasn't as if the building was locked up tight. The door looked worn, and the lock was barely holding the rotted wood together. Without giving herself time to second guess, Molly tried the door. It creaked open with an agonizing groan. Inside, the air was heavy with dust, the smell of old wood and rusting metal filling her lungs. Clocks of every shape and size lined the walls, their faces frozen in time, their pendulums still. The sound of her own footsteps echoed unnervingly loud in the otherwise silent shop. Her breath caught as she approached the counter, eyeing the collection of clocks that stood behind it. One, in particular, stood out to her. It was a tall, ornate grandfather clock, its wood intricately carved with twisting vines and strange symbols she didn't recognize. The clock's face was pristine, gleaming gold against the shadowy backdrop of the shop. Unlike the others, its hands were moving, but not in the usual rhythmic tick-tock she expected. No, this clock's hands spun in slow, lazy circles, sometimes forwards, sometimes backward, as if time itself was confused. Molly reached out, her fingers brushing the smooth surface of the clock. For a moment, she felt the faintest vibration beneath her hand, like a pulse, alive and waiting. And then, just as quickly, it stopped. But something else had changed. The shop, once silent, now filled with the soft ticking of clocks. Every single timepiece in the room had started again, their hands moving, their pendulums swinging in unison. The air grew heavier, the ticking growing louder, faster, filling her ears until it was all that she could hear. Molly stepped back, her heart racing. It didn't make sense. These clocks had been dead for years, maybe decades. Yet now they were alive, marking time with relentless precision. She turned to leave, but the door had been so easy to open was now shut tight. Panic rose in her chest as she pulled at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. She turned back toward the room, her eyes darting from clock to clock, their faces now spinning faster, their hands a blur. And then she saw it, the figure of an old man, hunched over, standing in the back corner of the shop. He wore an old-fashioned suit, his hair wild and unkempt, his eyes dark and sunken. His fingers twitched as he worked on a small, delicate timepiece, his back to her. "Mr. Garrett?" Molly's voice trembled, though she wasn't sure why she was even asking. The figure didn't respond, his hands still busy with the clock in front of him, but something about him felt wrong. His movements were jerky, mechanical, as though he were nothing more than a puppet, and she could hear the faint grinding of gears as he worked, though there were no visible machines. Gathering her courage, Molly took a step forward. "Sir, I'm sorry to intrude, but—" He stood up abruptly, turning to face her, his eyes locked onto hers, and she realized with horror that they weren't eyes at all, but empty sockets, dark and endless. His mouth twisted into a grimace, though his lips didn't move. The voice that echoed through the room wasn't his, but came from everywhere at once, low and rasping. "You shouldn't have touched the clock." Molly froze, her body trembling with fear. I didn't mean—" "The Timekeeper knows," the voice whispered, growing louder. "It knows you now." With a sound like grinding gears, the old man's body shuddered, his limbs twitching unnaturally. His head jerked to the side, and his mouth opened wide, far wider than should have been possible. The ticking of the clocks reached a deafening crescendo, the sound pounding in Molly's skull. She backed away, her heart slamming in her chest as the room began to blur. The hands of the clock spun faster, and with each turn, the world around her seemed to shift, distorting like a funhouse mirror. The walls stretched, the floor tilted, and the old man's twisted figure seemed to grow taller, looming over her, his empty eyes fixed on her. And then, silence. The clocks stopped, their hands frozen mid-spin. The room was still again, but it was different. The air was thicker, darker, and the world outside the shop seemed distant, unreachable. Molly turned toward the door, and to her horror, it was no longer a simple wooden frame, but a solid, seamless wall. Trapped. Panic surged through her. She ran to the window, but the glass reflected only darkness. No street, no town, just a black void stretching out forever. She was still in the clock shop, but not in her time. The ticking began again, slow and deliberate. The old man's voice echoed through the room, faint but clear. "Time has claimed you. It cannot be undone." Molly turned, her eyes wide with terror, but the old man was gone. The only thing left was the ticking, growing louder, closer. She was no longer a visitor in the clockmaster's shop. She was part of it now, and the clocks would never stop ticking. Some say the shop is still there, hidden from sight, a relic of time, but those who pass by swear they hear a soft ticking inside, even though the door remains locked. And if you listen closely, you might hear the faint whisper of a woman's voice, lost in time, forever. The small coastal village of Gray Harbor had always been shrouded in mist. It clung to the cliffs and blanketed the streets, but none was thicker than the fog that surrounded the old lighthouse. The beacon at the top hadn't been lit in years, not since the last lantern keeper vanished without a trace. Some say he had gone mad, others believe he had simply wandered off into the sea, but most of the villagers agreed on one thing: no one should go near the lighthouse after dark. Harper, a writer from the city, wasn't one for ghost stories. She had rented a cottage in Gray Harbor to finish her latest book, drawn to the quiet and the isolation. The locals were friendly enough, but they warned her time and again to stay away from the lighthouse. Curiosity, of course, got the better of her. One evening, after a particularly long day of writing, Harper found herself staring out her window at the faint outline of the lighthouse, its shadow barely visible through the swirling fog. The thought of a quick walk to clear her head seemed appealing, and before she knew it, she had grabbed her coat and set out towards the cliffs. The air was crisp, the mist damp against her skin as she made her way along the winding path. The lighthouse loomed closer with each step, its once bright stone now weathered and gray, standing like a sentinel over the sea. Harper paused at the base, staring up at the towering structure. There was something hauntingly beautiful about it, despite the warnings she had heard. Ignoring the chill that crept down her spine, she pushed open the rusted gate and walked toward the entrance. The heavy wooden door was slightly ajar, as if waiting for someone to enter. Harper hesitated only a moment before slipping inside. The air within was thick with the scent of salt and mildew. The narrow staircase spiraled up into the darkness, each step groaning beneath her weight. The walls were lined with old lanterns, their glass cracked and covered in dust, though none of them had been lit in years. Harper couldn't help but feel a strange sense of unease, but she shook it off, chalking it up to the eerie atmosphere. As she climbed higher, the sound of the wind outside grew distant, replaced by a faint, rhythmic noise. It was soft at first, almost imperceptible, but as she reached the top of the staircase, it became clearer, a steady, rhythmic scraping, like metal being dragged across stone. Harper pushed open the door to the lantern room, expecting to find it empty. Instead, she froze. There, standing by the darkened lantern, was a man. His back was to her, his thin frame draped in a long, tattered coat. His head was slightly bowed, and in his hands he held a large, rusted lantern. He was polishing it, the metal scraping against the stone floor with each slow, deliberate movement. Harper's breath caught in her throat. "Hello?" she called softly, though she wasn't sure why she was even speaking at all. Her instincts told her to turn and leave, but something about the man's presence kept her rooted in place. The man stopped polishing the lantern, but he didn't turn to face her. Instead, he spoke in a low, raspy voice. "You shouldn't be here." Harper swallowed hard. "I didn't mean to intrude. I was curious about the lighthouse." The man slowly lifted the lantern, holding it up toward the darkened beacon. "It hasn't been lit in years," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Not since the last storm." Harper frowned, taking a small step closer. What happened? For a moment, the man was silent. Then he turned, just enough for her to see his profile. His face was gaunt, his skin pale and stretched too tightly over his bones. His eyes, hollow and sunken, glinted in the dim light as he spoke. The sea claimed them, all of them, one by one. Harper's heart raced as the weight of his words sank in. She had heard the stories of shipwrecks and sailors lost to the unforgiving waves, but she hadn't thought much of them. After all, Gray Harbor had been known for its dangerous waters long before the lighthouse went dark. "But why didn't they relight the lantern?" she asked, her voice barely audible. The man turned fully now, and Harper took an involuntary step back. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and filled with something she couldn't quite place. Fear, perhaps, or something far worse. "The keeper never returned," he said, his voice trembling. "And the sea, it waits. It waits for the light." A sudden gust of wind rattled the windows of the lantern room, and the fog outside thickened, swirling around the lighthouse like a living thing. Harper's skin prickled with cold as the man took a step toward her, the lantern still clutched in his bony hands. "You've wokened it," he whispered. "The sea. It knows you're here now." Harper backed toward the door, her heart pounding in her chest. I don't understand," she stammered, her voice shaking. The man's eyes locked onto hers, and for the first time she saw the depth of the madness in his gaze. "It claimed the keeper," he rasped, "and it will claim you too, unless..." "Unless what?" He raised the lantern toward her, the glass reflecting the dim light from outside. "Unless the light is restored." Before she could respond, the room seemed to shift. The walls creaked, and the floor beneath her feet trembled. A low, deep rumble echoed through the lighthouse, like the roar of distant waves crashing against the cliffs. The man's face twisted with fear as he shoved the lantern into her hands. "Light it," he commanded, his voice urgent. "Light it, or the sea will take you." Harper fumbled with the lantern, her hands shaking. The wind outside howled, rattling the entire structure as the fog pressed in closer, wrapping around the lighthouse like a noose. She found the small tinderbox inside the lantern and struck a match, her breath catching as the flame flickered to life. But just as she touched the flame to the lantern's wick, the wind howled again, snuffing out the light in an instant. The man let out a low, guttural moan, his face contorting in despair. "It's too late," he whispered. "It's already here." Harper turned to the window, her blood running cold as she saw something moving in the fog. A shape, enormous and dark, shifting through the mist like a great shadow. The sea itself seemed to rise up, its waves crashing against the base of the lighthouse, sending tremors through the floor beneath her. And then she heard it, a voice, deep and ancient, calling to her from the depths of the fog. "Come to me." The walls groaned, and the windows shattered as the sea surged closer, flooding the room with icy water. Harper screamed, dropping the lantern as she tried to run, but the force of the water knocked her off her feet, dragging her toward the open window. As the freezing water pulled her under, she caught one last glimpse of the man standing by the darkened beacon, his face twisted in a strange, sorrowful smile. The sea had claimed her. The next morning, the lighthouse stood silent once more, its windows shattered, its wall damp with sea spray. The fog had lifted, but Harper was never found. The villagers knew better than to search. They had lost too many to the sea already. And at night, when the mist rolls in and the wind howls, they say you can still see the lantern's faint glow at the top of the lighthouse, a light that calls out to anyone foolish enough to venture too close. I never thought much about elevators. In a city as dense and vertical as this one, they were part of the background noise, a constant in the day-to-day. You pressed a button, waited for the doors to slide open, stepped inside, and that was it. A short, mindless trip to wherever you needed to be. No one ever gave them a second thought. But now, I can't stop thinking about them, specifically that elevator. It was a Wednesday when I first noticed something was off. I had just started a new job in one of those sleek, high-rise office buildings that seemed to touch the sky. The kind of place with polished marble floors, walls of glass, and lobbies that echo your footsteps. My office was on the 27th floor, which meant I used the elevator several times a day, like everyone else in the building. The day had been long, full of meetings and deadlines, and I was one of the last people to leave. It was already dark by the time I stepped into the elevator, and the office was mostly empty. The hum of fluorescent lights was the only sound as I pressed the button for the lobby. The doors slid shut, and the familiar hum of the elevator began. I leaned back against the wall, staring blankly at the floor numbers as they lit up one by one. But then, somewhere around the 18th floor, the elevator jerked suddenly, like it had hit something. Not hard, but enough to make me straighten up, my pulse quickening. The lights above the door flickered, and the elevator stopped. Just like that, it went still, the hum of motion replaced by an unsettling silence. I stared at the numbers above the door, waiting for them to change, but they didn't. I was stuck. I pressed the button for the lobby again. Nothing. I pressed the emergency call button. Silence. No response, no intercom crackling to life. I tried to stay calm. Elevators got stuck all the time, right? Someone would notice soon. But as I stood there, my hand hovering over the emergency button, I felt the air change. It was subtle at first, almost unnoticeable, but the longer I stood there, the more I realized something was wrong. The air was thick, heavy. The small, enclosed space felt like it was closing in on me, even though I knew that wasn't possible. Then, from somewhere above me, I heard a noise. A faint, rhythmic clicking. Slow at first, like the sound of gears turning in the walls, but growing louder. I looked up, expecting to see something malfunctioning, but the ceiling was just a smooth panel, featureless except for the vent. The clicking grew more persistent, faster, and I could feel it reverberating through the walls, like something was crawling through the shafts, something mechanical. I stepped back, my heart hammering. The clicking sound stopped abruptly, and for a moment, everything was still. Then the lights went out. Total darkness. My breath felt stuck in my throat as I fumbled for my phone, the small screen the only source of light in the pitch-black elevator. The silence felt suffocating, but there was something else. A presence. I can't explain it, but it was as if I wasn't alone anymore. The space felt different, like it was filled with something I couldn't see. I reached out, my fingers brushing the cold metal of the elevator wall, trying to steady myself. My phone screen flickered, and for a brief second, the floor beneath me seemed to shift, like the elevator was moving again, but not in the way that it should have been. It was a strange, disorienting feeling, like the elevator was slowly drifting sideways, not up or down. I pressed myself against the wall, trying to rationalize what was happening. Maybe it was a power outage, a technical glitch, but deep down, I knew it was something more, something I didn't understand. Suddenly, the elevator jolted again, and the lights flickered back on. The floor display above the door read 27 again, as if nothing had happened. I exhaled shakily, pressing the button for the lobby once more. The elevator resumed its descent without further incident, the familiar hum returning, but my pulse didn't slow. When the doors finally opened in the lobby, I nearly ran out, my heart still pounding in my chest. The security guard at the desk looked up from his phone, raising an eyebrow. "You all right?" he asked, his voice indifferent, like this was just another day. I nodded quickly, not trusting myself to speak. My legs felt shaky, but I forced myself to walk calmly out of the building, trying to shake off the feeling of unease. The cool night air hit me as I stepped outside, and I finally let myself breathe. For the rest of the week, I avoided that elevator. I told myself it was irrational, that I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe it had been a mild panic attack, triggered by exhaustion. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself, I couldn't shake the memory of that clicking sound, or the way the air had felt so thick and wrong. The following Monday, I decided to take the stairs, even though that meant an exhausting climb up to the 27th floor. As I passed by the elevators, I saw a maintenance worker standing by one of the doors, his toolbox open on the floor. He was muttering to himself as he unscrewed the panel above the door. "Excuse me," I called, trying to sound casual. "Was there something wrong with the elevator last week?" The man looked up, his face tired and lined with age. He wiped his hands on a rag and shook his head. "Not that I know of," he said. "We've had complaints here and there, but nothing major. These old elevators can be finicky sometimes." I nodded, ready to move on, when he added, almost as an afterthought, "But it's weird, though. You're not the first person to ask about it this month. One of the tenants swears they heard something in the walls, said it sounded like—" He paused, tapping his screwdriver against the metal door, like someone else was in there with them. I felt a chill run down my spine, and I quickly thanked him before walking away, my steps quicker than before. I didn't ask any more questions. I didn't want to know. But now, every time I walk past the elevators, I listen. And sometimes, in the quiet of the early morning or the late evening when the building is almost empty, I hear it. The faint, rhythmic clicking from deep within the walls. I haven't taken the elevator since. It started with the TV. I had always been a night owl, so it wasn't unusual for me to have the TV on late into the evening, the low hum of infomercials or reruns filling the empty space in my apartment. It wasn't that I needed the noise, but there was something comforting about it, something about knowing I wasn't completely alone. But then the static came. It was subtle at first, a quick flicker, maybe a second of that familiar snowstorm of pixels before the show would cut back in, as if nothing had happened. I didn't think much of it at first. It was an old TV after all. Sometimes things just glitch. but the static kept coming back, more frequently now, and it wasn't random anymore. It was the same time every night, 2:15 a.m. on the dot. I'd be half asleep, dozing off on the couch, when the sound would start, the soft crackling of static filling the room. The picture would disappear, replaced by that ball of fuzz and distortion. No matter what channel I was on, no matter what I was watching, the TV would always flip to static at 2:15. The first night it happened, I tried to change the channel, but the remote didn't respond, the buttons clicking uselessly in my hand. The TV was locked on the static. Confused and a little annoyed, I unplugged the TV, thinking that would reset it. But the moment I plugged it back in, the static was still there. I stared at the screen, my heart beating a little faster now. It wasn't just the image, there was something in the sound, too. Beneath the hiss of the static, there was a faint pattern, almost like voices. But they weren't clear, just garbled fragments of speech lost in the noise. It was like someone trying to talk to me, but I couldn't make out the words. After what felt like an eternity, the screen flickered again, and the static vanished. The show that I had been watching resumed, and the remote worked as if nothing had ever been wrong. I told myself it was just a glitch, some interference with the signal. But the next night, the same thing happened. At exactly 2:15 a.m., the static returned, louder this time, more insistent. I tried turning off the TV, but the power button didn't work. The TV just stayed on, crackling and buzzing, the voices buried somewhere deep within the noise. I couldn't sleep that night. After the third night, I decided to call the cable company. They told me that there were no outages, no technical issues, and that everything should be fine on their end. They suggested it might be my TV, that maybe it was time for a new one. So I bought a new TV. The first night with the new television, I felt a sense of relief. I settled into the couch, flipping through the channels, the familiar glow of the screen washing over the room. Midnight came and went, and I started to drift off, confident that the strange static was behind me. But at 2:15 a.m., the screen flickered, the static returned. I bolted upright, staring at the new TV in disbelief. The same sound, the same pattern of garbled voices filled the room. The remote was useless again, the power button ineffective. It was as though the TV had a mind of its own, locked onto the static with an eerie precision. This time, I didn't try to change the channel. I just listened. The voices, though faint and distorted, seemed closer now, more distinct. I couldn't make out any words, but the rhythm of the sound was unmistakably human, like a conversation happening just beyond my reach. It felt like they were trying to communicate with me, but something was holding them back, distorting the signal. I stood up, pacing the room, my skin crawling with unease. I glanced at the clock. 2:23 a.m. The static always lasted exactly 8 minutes. As the screen finally flickered back to normal, I found myself staring at the blank TV, my heart racing. I didn't know what was happening, but it felt personal now, like someone or something was trying to get through to me. The next night, I didn't sleep. I sat in front of the TV, waiting. I didn't turn it on this time. I just sat there, the remote in my hand, staring at the dark screen as the minutes ticked by. The TV turned on by itself. My breath caught in my throat as the static filled the screen once again. The voices were louder now, more urgent, but still distorted beyond recognition. The crackling of the static seemed to fill the entire apartment, the air thick with it. And then, just as I leaned in closer, trying to make out the sound, I heard it, clear as day, through the distortion. My name. The static whispered my name. I stumbled back, my pulse pounding in my ears. I hadn't imagined it. I couldn't have. The voice, though faint, had been there, calling me. I stood frozen, my mind racing. Who could be doing this? Why would they know my name? The static persisted for its usual 8 minutes before the screen flickered back to black. But this time, it left something behind. The remote in my hand buzzed softly, and I glanced down to see the number on the screen. Channel 28. I hadn't pressed anything, but the remote was telling me to go to 28. Against my better judgment, I pressed the button. The screen flickered to life, and for a moment, it was just black, an empty channel, no signal. And then the image appeared. It was a grainy, low-quality video, the kind you'd see from an old security camera. The picture was shaky, the colors washed out, but I could make out a small room, dimly lit, walls bare, with a single chair in the center. The chair was empty. The video stayed on the chair for what felt like hours. Nothing moved, no sound, no change in the picture, just that empty chair. Then, just as I was about to turn off the TV, the camera zoomed in, focusing on something carved into the back of the chair. My heart raced as the image slowly became clearer, the letters scratched into the wood. It was my name. The screen flickered again, and the static roared back to life, louder than before, filling the room with an unbearable noise. I stumbled backward, the remote slipping from my hand and clattering to the floor. My breath was coming in shallow gasps now, my heart thudding against my ribs. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the static cut off. Silence. The TV went black, leaving the room in total darkness. I stood there, frozen, staring at the dead screen, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But the silence just stretched on, heavy and thick. No sound, no flicker of light, just the quiet hum of the city outside, the faint creak of the buildings settling. I reached for the remote, my hands trembling, and pressed the power button. The screen stayed black. I pressed it again, harder this time, but the TV didn't respond. The remote was dead, the TV unresponsive. It was over. Or so I thought. Just as I let out a breath, trying to calm the storm inside me, my phone buzzed on the table, the screen lighting up with a new notification. A message. With shaking hands, I picked it up and unlocked the screen. There was only one new message from an unknown number. It was a single word. Look. As I stood there, trying to process what was happening, my phone's camera app opened on its own. The screen flickered to life, showing the live feed from my front-facing camera, showing me. But behind me, reflected in the dark, unlit TV screen, was the chair from the video. And now it wasn't empty. The smell was the first thing I noticed. It wasn't strong, at least not at first, but it lingered in the air of my apartment like a forgotten scent of something long past. I thought it was just usual city funk that sometimes drifts through the windows of older buildings. Mildew, garbage, maybe something left to rot in the alleyway behind my place. But over time, it got worse. At first, I tried to ignore it. It was faint, only noticeable when I sat for too long, when the hum of daily life faded and I could focus on it. But it didn't go away. The smell became more persistent, like a damp, earthy odor that settled into my furniture and into my clothes. It was a mix of wet soil, mold, and something else, something sour and metallic, like rusted iron or old blood. I checked everywhere in my apartment, the pipes under the sink, the drains, the garbage disposal, nothing. I scrubbed the floors, cleaned out the fridge, even had the landlord send someone to check the walls for leaks. But there was no source. The smell just hung there, inescapable and sour. After a few days, it got worse. I started waking up in the middle of the night, the stench filling my nostrils, making it hard to breathe. The air in my apartment felt heavy, damp, like the smell was soaking into everything. No matter how much I cleaned, no matter how many windows I opened, it didn't fade. One night, after another restless sleep, I woke up to find the smell had changed. It was stronger, sharper now, almost unbearable. It wasn't just mold or dampness anymore. It was something decaying, something dead. I gagged as I stumbled through the apartment, trying to figure out where it was coming from. The walls seemed to close in around me, the air thick with rot. I ran to the bathroom, certain I was going to be sick, but as I leaned over the sink, I saw it. Something was wrong with the mirror. It looked normal at first glance, just the reflection of my bathroom, but when I stepped closer, I noticed a dark stain in the corner of the glass, like a patch of mold spreading slowly across the surface. I leaned in, peering closer. The stain wasn't just on the glass, it was behind it. Something was inside the mirror. I reached out, my fingers hovering just over the cold surface of the glass. The dark stain pulsed, almost like it was alive, and the smell hit me like a wave, stronger than ever. It was coming from the mirror. Backing away, my mind raced. There was no explanation for it. Mirrors don't rot. There shouldn't be anything behind the glass. I grabbed a towel, pressed it against my nose to block the smell, and rushed to the living room. My hands shook as I picked up the phone and dialed the landlord again. I didn't care if it was the middle of the night. I needed someone to come fix this. The phone rang, and rang, and rang. No answer. I dropped the phone, my pulse quickening. I didn't want to go back into the bathroom, but the smell was everywhere now, filling the entire apartment. It was suffocating, like I was breathing in decay itself. I had to do something. Maybe if I smashed the mirror, I thought, it would stop. Grabbing a hammer from under the kitchen sink, I made my way back to the bathroom, my stomach twisting with every step. The mirror loomed ahead, the dark stain spreading further across the glass, almost covering half of it. The smell was so thick, I could barely think. I raised the hammer, my hands trembling, and swung. The glass shattered with a deafening crash, shards flying in every direction. For a moment, the air seemed to clear, the smell dissipating as if I had broken whatever was causing it, but then I saw it. Behind the shattered glass, there was a hole. Not just a crack, but an actual hole in the wall behind the mirror, a dark space that shouldn't have been there. My heart pounded as I knelt down, shining my phone's flashlight into the hole. The light flickered over something inside, something fleshy. I squinted, trying to make sense of it, but the smell hit me again, worse than before, nearly knocking me over. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what I was looking at. It wasn't mold, it wasn't dampness, it was a body. The rotting remains of something or someone was crammed into the wall behind the mirror, decayed and twisted. Its skin a sickly gray-green, its flesh partially decomposed. I stumbled back, the bile rising in my throat, but my eyes couldn't tear away from the hole. The body was wedged deep into the wall, as if it had been there for years. Hidden behind the mirror, decaying in secret. I scrambled out of the bathroom, my heart racing, and grabbed my phone again, my fingers shaking as I dialed the police. This time they picked up. I could barely form the words, my voice cracking as I tried to explain what I have found. They arrived quickly, though the minutes felt like hours as I sat in the hallway outside of my apartment, trying to block out the lingering stench. When the police entered the bathroom, I heard one of them gasp, followed by the sound of hurried whispers. They didn't let me back inside after that. The apartment was sealed off as a crime scene, and I was sent to a hotel for the night. I didn't argue. I didn't want to go back, not after what I had seen. The next day, I was called in for questioning. The detective was calm, almost clinical, as he asked me about the smell, about the mirror, about the body in the wall, but his face changed when I mentioned the rotting corpse. "There was no body," he said, his voice flat. I stared at him. "What do you mean? I saw it. It was right there." "We found an old space behind the mirror, yes," he continued, "but there was no body, just debris, old insulation, rotted wood, no remains." I sat there, stunned. I knew what I had seen. I knew what I had smelled. But the detective insisted that there was nothing there. No body, no evidence of anything out of the ordinary. I left the station in a daze, my mind racing. I tried to tell myself that they were wrong, that they had missed something, but deep down, I knew. The smell, the body, whatever it was behind that mirror wasn't something that they could explain, and I couldn't forget it. Now, even in the new apartment I've moved to, I can still smell it sometimes. Faint at first, but growing stronger, like something rotting just beneath the surface. And I wonder, how long before I find out what's hiding here? I've always lived alone, and I liked it that way. There was a certain peace that came with having my own space, a quiet comfort in knowing I didn't have to answer to anyone when I got home. My apartment wasn't much, just a small place on the 4th floor of an old building, but it was mine. The kind of place where you could hear the floor creak as you walked, where the pipes rattled at odd hours, and the walls were thin enough to catch the occasional sound of my neighbors talking or watching TV. It wasn't perfect, but it was home. One night, about 6 months after moving in, something changed. I was in bed, scrolling through my phone, ready to drift off to sleep, when I heard it. 3 soft knocks, not on my door, but from the inside of my apartment. Tap, tap, tap. I sat up, startled. The sound came from the wall near the window, where there shouldn't have been anything to knock on. I stared into the darkness for a moment, listening, but the sound didn't come again. I convinced myself it was nothing, probably the pipes or the building settling, the usual noises that come from an old place. I tried to push it out of my mind, but that night I didn't sleep well. The next night, it happened again. I was just starting to doze off when I heard it. Tap, tap, tap. It was clearer this time, louder. Again, it seemed to come from the wall near the window, like someone was knocking from inside the wall itself. I turned on the light, heart pounding, and checked the room. There was nothing, no sign of anyone, no explanation for the sound, just silence, thick and unnerving. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, that maybe I was half asleep and hearing things that weren't there. But the next few nights, the knocking continued. Always 3 knocks, always from the same spot. I started feeling uneasy in my own apartment. During the day, everything was fine, normal even. But at night, as soon as the sun went down, the atmosphere shifted. It felt like the walls were watching me, like there was something just beneath the surface, waiting for me to notice. A week later, the knocking changed. It was late, around midnight, and I was sitting on the couch watching TV when the knocks came again. But this time, they weren't soft. They were sharp, insistent, like someone pounding on the wall, demanding to be let in. My heart raced as I muted the TV and listened. Tap, tap, tap. I stood up, my pulse quickening. The knocks were so loud now, so deliberate, that they echoed through the apartment. I grabbed my phone, ready to call the landlord, but just as I was about to dial, the knocking stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I asked my neighbors if they heard anything strange. None of them had. They all gave me the same puzzled looks, insisting that they hadn't heard a thing. I even asked the landlord to check the pipes, thinking that maybe there was some kind of issue with the building's plumbing, but he found nothing. I tried to ignore it. I tried to convince myself it was just the building, that old places made strange noises, and there was nothing to worry about. But every night, the knocking came back, and every night it grew louder, closer, until one night it didn't come from the wall. It came from the window. I was in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep, when I heard the first knock, not from the wall, but from the glass on the window itself. 3 slow, deliberate taps. My breath caught in my throat, and I slowly turned to look. There, standing just outside the window, was a figure, a silhouette barely visible in the darkness, standing on the narrow ledge 4 stories up. It wasn't possible. No one could be standing out there. But the figure didn't move, didn't flinch. It just stood there, staring in through the glass, as if it had been watching me for hours. I couldn't see its face, just the outline of a person, tall and thin, with their head slightly tilted, and then, slowly, it raised a hand and knocked again. Tap, tap, tap. My heart pounded in my chest as I sat frozen in bed, staring at the figure. I wanted to scream, to move, to do something, but I couldn't. The figure didn't try to open the window. It didn't move closer. It just knocked, over and over, waiting for me to react. Finally, I forced myself to move. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand, my hands shaking as I dialed 911. The operator's voice came through the line, but I couldn't speak. All I could do was stare at the figure, its shadowy hand still resting against the glass, knocking in the same steady rhythm. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure stepped back into the darkness. One moment it was there, the next it was gone. The police arrived within minutes, but by then there was no trace of anyone. The window was locked from the inside, the ledge outside was too narrow for anyone to stand on, and there were no fire escapes or balconies nearby. The officers checked the building, but they found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no footprints on the ledge, nothing. I moved out the next day. But sometimes, even in my new place, far away from that apartment, I still hear it, late at night, just as I'm drifting off to sleep. Tap, tap, tap. I'd always taken the subway home after work. It was the easiest way to navigate the city, cheap, quick, and reliable. After years of riding the same train every day, I could do it on autopilot. I knew the stations by heart, the regulars who boarded at certain stops, and even the rhythm of the train's movement as it rattled down the tracks. That night was no different. It had been a long day at the office, and I was ready to go home, put my feet up, and forget about work. The station was mostly empty, the usual quiet buzz of late commuters filling the air. I caught the train like I always did, the familiar whoosh of the doors opening and welcoming me into the dimly lit carriage. There were a few other passengers, a man in a suit reading a newspaper, a woman with her headphones in, and an older couple sitting quietly near the doors. It felt normal, comforting even. I found my usual seat by the window and settled in, the hum of the train lulling me into a half-asleep state as it pulled away from the platform. About 3 stops in, I noticed something odd. The announcements weren't coming through. Normally, the automated voice would call out each station name as we arrived, giving passengers a heads up for their stop. But tonight, it was silent. The train rolled through station after station without a word, the doors opening and closing with no announcement. I pulled out my phone to check the time, but there was no signal. Typical for the subway, I thought. The train continued on, and I leaned back, deciding not to worry about it. Maybe it was a glitch in the system. But as the train passed the station that should have been mine, my stomach twisted. The doors didn't open, and the train didn't slow down. It just kept moving, speeding through the station like it didn't exist. I sat up, suddenly wide awake, and looked around the car. No one else seemed bothered. The man was still reading his newspaper. The woman with the headphones hadn't moved. The older couple sat perfectly still, staring straight ahead. It was as if they hadn't noticed we'd missed a stop. I stood up, gripping the pole beside me as I made my way toward the front of the car. I pressed the button for the emergency intercom, but there was no response. The speaker was silent. I turned back to the passengers. "Excuse me," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "Does anyone know why the train isn't stopping?" The man with the newspaper slowly looked up at me. His face was pale, his eyes dull. He blinked, but said nothing, then went back to reading as if I wasn't there. I turned to the others. The woman with the headphones didn't react at all. The older couple didn't even glance my way. It was like I was invisible. Panic started to creep in. I moved to the next car, hoping to find someone, anyone, who could tell me what was going on. But as I stepped through the doors, I froze. The car was empty. Completely empty. I stood there for a moment, staring at the rows of empty seats, trying to make sense of it. I could have sworn there were people in this car when I boarded. I backed out, returning to the car I had come from, but when I stepped through the doors, something was wrong. The passengers were gone. The man with the newspaper, the woman with the headphones, the older couple, vanished. The seats where they had been sitting were empty now, as if they had never been there at all. The train hummed along, the sound of the wheels on the tracks echoing in the eerie silence. My pulse quickened. I ran to the nearest door and tried to pry it open, but it was locked. I banged on it, yelling for someone, anyone, to help, but the sound was swallowed by the endless hum of the train. I checked my phone again, still no signal. The time hadn't changed. It was stuck at 8:43, the exact moment I had first checked when I boarded. That's when I noticed the lights. They were flickering, not in the usual way, like a power surge or a bad connection, but in a strange, rhythmic pattern, on and off, like the train itself was breathing. The air grew colder, the flickering lights casting long, dancing shadows across the empty seats. I backed away, my breath coming in shallow gasps, as I headed toward the back of the train, hoping to find the conductor. As I moved through the cars, one after another, they all looked the same. Empty, silent, with the same flickering lights. No people, no sound, just endless rumble of the train speeding down the tracks to God knows where. I was about to turn back when I reached the last car, and that's when I saw it. There was someone sitting at the very back, in the far corner. For a moment, relief washed over me. Finally, someone who could explain what was happening. I hurried toward the figure, calling out as I approached, but as I got closer, my steps slowed. Something wasn't right. The figure was hunched over, its back to me, completely still. Its clothes were old, ragged, covered in dirt and grime, as if they hadn't been washed in years. And its head was too low, as though it had no neck, or its spine was bent at an impossible angle. "Excuse me?" I said, my voice barely a whisper now. Are you okay?" The figure didn't move. I stepped closer, reaching out a hand. The air around me grew colder, and the flickering lights seemed to pulse in time with my racing heart. Then, slowly, the figure turned. Its face was wrong, twisted, pale and sunken, with wide, empty eyes that seemed to stare through me. Its mouth hung open, unnaturally wide, like it was frozen mid-scream, though no sound came from it. It looked dead, decayed. I stumbled back, gasping for breath, and the figure stood. It moved towards me, slow and deliberate, its head still tilted at the sickening angle, its hollow eyes locked on mine. I turned and ran, sprinting through the empty cars, my footsteps echoing in the silence. Behind me, I heard it following. The train was endless. Car after car, I ran, but there was no end, no conductor, no other passengers, just that thing, following me, its footsteps growing louder, closer. I reached the front of the train, gasping for air, and slammed my fists against the door to the conductor's compartment. "Help, please help me." No response. I turned, my back against the door, just in time to see the figure step through the last car. Its eyes were glowing now, its mouth still hanging open in that horrific, silent scream. It moved faster, closing the distance between us with terrifying speed. There was nowhere left to run. The lights flickered one last time, then went out completely, plunging the train into darkness. And the last thing I heard, before everything went silent, was the sound of the doors opening. I woke up in the hospital. They told me they found me unconscious on the platform, just outside the train. I had passed out, they said. Exhaustion, maybe stress. I tried to tell them about the train, about the figure, but they just shook their heads. "There was no train," they said. "You were alone when we found you." I know that's not true. And now, every night, I dream of that train, the flickering lights, the empty cars, and that figure, always at the back, always waiting. I know it's still out there, and someday it'll come for me again. When I bought the house, it was a steal, an old Victorian with history, character, and more rooms than I knew what to do with. It had been empty for years, the kind of place that sits on the market, slowly decaying until someone finally sees its potential. That someone was me. I wasn't deterred by the fact that it needed work. The bones were solid, and I had always dreamed of restoring a place like this. The creaking floors, the high ceilings, the original moldings, it all felt like something out of a novel. It was perfect. Well, almost. There was one thing I didn't understand when I first moved in. The door at the end of the upstairs hallway. It was a simple wooden door, painted the same faded white as the others, but unlike the others, it was locked. And not just locked, it was bolted. Rusted padlocks and a heavy iron bar sealed it shut, as if someone had gone to great lengths to ensure no one could get inside. There was no key, and none of the paperwork from the sale mentioned anything about what was behind it. At first, I wasn't too concerned. The house had been through multiple owners over the decades, and I figured maybe someone had simply used it for storage. Maybe it was a safety precaution, or maybe there was nothing behind it at all. I was more focused on the renovations, fixing the plumbing, repainting the walls, replacing broken windows. The locked door could wait. But as the weeks went by, I found myself thinking about it more and more. I would pass it every day on my way to the bedroom, catching myself staring at the rusted locks, wondering what could possibly be behind it. Why go through so much effort to seal off a single room? What were they trying to keep out? Or keep in? Eventually, my curiosity got the better of me. One afternoon, I decided to take a closer look. I grabbed a flashlight and crouched down to examine the locks. They were old, decades old, the kind you don't see anymore. The iron bar that stretched across the door was thick, with heavy bolts anchoring it into frame. Whoever had done this hadn't been messing around. I tried the doorknob, but it didn't budge. The whole thing felt cold to the touch, like it hadn't been opened in years, maybe longer. I knew I should have let it go. There were 100 other projects waiting for me around the house, and this door could easily stay locked forever without causing any issues. But it was the mystery of it that gnawed at me, the not knowing. So I made a decision. I was going to open it. It took some time, but eventually tracked down a locksmith willing to come out to the house. He was an older guy, the kind that had been doing this kind of work for years. When I showed him the door, he raised an eyebrow. "Bit overkill, don't you think?" he muttered, running his hand over the rusted locks. "Yeah," I said, feeling a little embarrassed now. "I just want to know what's behind it." The locksmith shrugged, and after about 30 minutes of cutting, prying, and removing the old hardware, the locks were off. The iron bar creaked as he lifted it, and the door, now unsealed for the first time in who knows how long, stood before me. "All yours," the locksmith said with a nod before heading out, leaving me alone in the dim hallway. I stood there for a moment, hand on the doorknob, suddenly unsure. But curiosity is a powerful thing, and I couldn't walk away now. With a deep breath, I twisted the knob and pushed the door open. It swung inward with a groan, revealing a small, dusty room. The first thing I noticed was how stale the air was, like the room had been sealed for years without a single breath of fresh air. Dust motes hung in the beam of my flashlight, swirling in the stillness. The room itself was empty, except for a few pieces of old furniture, a wooden chair, a small dresser, and a full-length mirror covered in a sheet. I stepped inside, the floor creaking beneath my weight, and ran my fingers over the surface of the dresser. Thick with dust, untouched for what seemed like decades. The place was barren, neglected, and yet something felt off. I turned my attention to the mirror, hesitating for a moment before pulling the sheet off. The glass was foggy, old, but otherwise just a mirror, nothing unusual. I set the sheet aside and turned back towards the door, wondering why anyone had bothered to lock this room so tightly. That's when I noticed it. The wall opposite the door, just above the chair, had something written on it, faint, barely visible in the dim light, but unmistakable. I stepped closer, squinting to make out the faded letters scrawled in a shaky hand. Do not open. The words were scratched into the paint, jagged and uneven, as if someone had written them in a hurry, desperate to leave a message. My stomach twisted. I backed away slowly, the weight of the room settling on me like a heavy blanket. The air felt thicker now, oppressive. I hadn't noticed it before, but there was a coldness in the room, a chill that crept over my skin. I turned to leave, suddenly eager to get out of there, but as I reached the door, something caught my eye. A small, metal object lay on the floor, half buried in the dust. I bent down to pick it up. It was a key. The key that matched the old locks that I had just removed. I stared at it, my mind racing. Why had the key been left inside the room, locked away? And who had written those words on the wall? The feeling of unease grew stronger, and I shoved the key into my pocket, stepping out of the room and pulling the door shut behind me. For the next few days, I tried to forget about the room, but something about it clung to me. No matter how much I told myself it was just an empty space, that the writing on the wall was probably some kind of a joke or the paranoia of a previous owner, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had made a mistake. At night, I started hearing things. It began as faint creaks, almost imperceptible, like the house settling, but they always seemed to come from upstairs, from the direction of the locked room. I told myself it was my imagination, that old houses made noises. Still, the sound grew louder as the nights passed. One evening, just as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard it again, sharp, deliberate. Creaking footsteps coming from the upstairs hallway. It was unmistakable. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no one else in the house. I grabbed my phone, trying to steady my breathing, and slowly made my way towards the staircase. I could hear it more clearly now, slow, deliberate steps, like someone was pacing back and forth in front of the locked door. I paused at the base of the stairs, listening. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, everything was silent, and I considered turning back, going to bed, and pretending I had heard nothing. Then came the sound I had been dreading. The door. It creaked, the unmistakable sound of wood groaning, as if it had been opened. But I had shut it. I knew I had. Slowly, I crept up the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last, the air around me thick with dread. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched out before me, dimly lit by the single overhead light. The door at the end of the hall, the door I had locked and closed, was now ajar. I stood frozen, my heart racing, my breath shallow. The room was dark, the faintest sliver of blackness visible through the crack in the door. My mind raced. I should leave. I should go back downstairs, call someone, get out of the house. But my legs wouldn't move. Then, from inside the room, I heard it. A soft, wet, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. It was slow, deliberate, the kind of noise that makes your stomach drop, because you know whatever's making it isn't in any hurry. My hands trembled as I reached for the light switch at the end of the hall, flipping it on. The light flickered and buzzed, casting a dim glow on the floor, and that's when I saw it, just at the threshold of the room. A streak of something dark smeared across the floor, something wet, something fresh. The dragging sound stopped. The silence was deafening, pressing in on me from all sides. I stepped closer, my heart thundering in my chest, the walls of the hallway seeming to narrow with every step I took toward the door. I reached it, and with trembling fingers pushed it open the rest of the way. But the room was empty. But on the floor, just beneath the window, something was smeared in large, jagged letters. not scratched into the wall this time, written. You shouldn't have opened it. My stomach lurched, then the smell hit me, thick, metallic, like rust and decay. I stumbled back, my foot slipping in something wet, and I fell to the ground. I looked down. My hands were covered in it, dark, red streaks running across the floor, leading toward the corner of the room, a pool of it, glistening in the dim light. And then I saw something move. From the corner, something shifted, a shape. Not a person, not an animal, just something. Twisted and wrong, like it was trying to drag itself out of the shadows. I couldn't make out the details, just a glimpse of something pale and bloated, covered in dark, matted hair. The dragging sound resumed, louder now, faster, coming straight toward me. I scrambled to my feet, my hands slipping on the blood-streaked floor as I ran for the door. I slammed it shut behind me, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could hear it on the other side, scraping against the floor, moving towards the door. The handle began to rattle. I bolted down the stairs, not stopping until I was outside, gasping for air in the cold night. The house stood silent, still, like nothing had ever happened. But I knew better. I left that night. I didn't care about the repairs, about the work I had put into the house. I didn't care about selling it. I just needed to get out. I left everything behind, driving as far as I could, until the house was just a memory. But even now, I can't forget. I can still hear it, the slow, wet dragging coming from behind that door, and I know one day it'll find a way out. When I first bought the old farmhouse, I was drawn to its isolation. It sat at the edge of a dense forest, miles from the nearest town, with nothing but trees and silence surrounding it. It was the perfect place for a fresh start, a place to get away from the noise, to slow down, and maybe even figure out who I was without the city pressing in on me. The house itself was charming in its own way, even though it needed some work. The roof was a bit saggy, the floors creaked, and the paint had long since faded, but I didn't mind. I liked the idea of fixing it up, making it mine. I even liked the overgrown fields and the way the forest seemed to loom over the back of the house, like it was guarding a secret. There was just one thing I couldn't explain. The first day I moved in, I found a note taped to the front door. It was a single sheet of yellowed paper, the edges curling as if it had been there for some time. The handwriting was shaky, scrawled in thick black ink. Don't stay out after dark. They arrive when the sun sets. I stared at the note, confused and a little amused. It had to be some kind of joke, maybe from the local trying to scare the new neighbor. I crumpled it up and tossed it in the trash, not giving it a second thought. People in small towns have strange senses of humor sometimes. But that night, as the sun began to set, I noticed something strange. It was subtle at first, a kind of heaviness in the air, like the world was holding its breath. The birds that had been chirping all day went silent, the wind stopped rustling the trees, and even the distant hum of insects seemed to fade. It was as if the entire forest had suddenly gone still, waiting for something. I brushed it off as nerves. After all, moving to a place like this after years in the city was bound to feel a little strange. I made myself a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the last light of the day disappear behind the treetops. That's when I saw them. At first, they were just shadows, barely visible at the edge of the forest. I squinted, thinking it might be the play of the fading light, but the shadows didn't move like branches or leaves. They moved like people, slowly, deliberately, stepping out from between the trees. I stood up, my heart beginning to race. There were at least 5 or 6 of them, all moving toward the house, their figures blurry in the twilight. I couldn't make out any details, just dark shapes, like silhouettes against the fading sky. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the isolation was getting to me. Maybe it was deer or some other animal, and my mind was playing tricks. But then they stopped. They stopped right at the edge of the field, just beyond the line where the forest met the tall grass, and they stood there, perfectly still, watching. A chill ran down my spine. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was hunters or locals passing through. But as the darkness deepened, the shapes didn't move. They just stood there, as if waiting for something. The memory of the note came back to me, sharp and clear. They arrive when the sun sets. I grabbed my phone, intending to call someone, anyone, but there was no signal. Typical for a place this remote, I thought, my hands shaking as I looked back out the window. The figures were closer now. They hadn't moved. Not that I had seen, but somehow they were closer to the house. The edge of the forest was farther away now, and the shadows were clearer, more defined. I still couldn't make out their faces, but I could see the shapes of their bodies, tall, unnaturally thin, with arms that seemed too long, dangling by their sides. I stumbled away from the window, my breath catching in my throat. This wasn't normal. This wasn't a joke. I ran to the front door, checking the locks, then went to every window, pulling the curtains shut. I didn't know what I was trying to block out, but I didn't want to see them anymore. The house was silent, except for the sound of my own breathing. I paced the living room, trying to calm down, telling myself it was just some weird local prank. But the feeling in the air, that heaviness, was still there. It felt like something was pressing down on the house, on me. Then came the knocking. It was soft at first, 3 slow knocks on the front door, just loud enough to make me freeze. I stood perfectly still, staring at the door, my heart pounding in my chest. The knock came again, 3 knocks, measured and deliberate. I took a step towards the door, my legs shaking. Maybe it was someone who could explain what was happening. Maybe it was someone who could help. But before I reached the door, I heard it again. This time, the knocking wasn't coming from the front door. It was coming from the windows. Knock, knock, knock. First from the living room window, then from the kitchen, then the back door. The sound echoed through the house, moving from one window to the next, as if something or someone was circling the house, testing every entrance. I backed away, retreating to the center of the room, my hands trembling. I didn't dare go near the windows, but I could hear the knocking growing louder, more insistent. Whatever was outside wanted to come in. Suddenly, I remembered the note, "Don't stay out after dark." I wasn't outside, but it didn't seem to matter. They were here, and they weren't leaving. The knocking stopped. The silence that followed was worse. I stood in the middle of the room, straining to hear anything, my pulse roaring in my ears. I didn't know if I should move, if I should hide, or if I should run, but every instinct told me not to look out the windows. Then, from the back door, I heard something different, the sound of the door handle turning. Slowly, painfully slowly, the handle turned with a soft creak. My breath hitched in my throat as I stared at the door, paralyzed. The handle turned all the way, and then, with a quiet click, the door began to open. I didn't wait to see what came through. I ran upstairs, locking myself in the bedroom, and called the police, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. The knocking had started again, louder now, as if they were trying to break the windows. It felt like hours before the police arrived. When they did, the knocking stopped immediately. I heard the sound of car doors slamming, footsteps outside, and then a voice calling my name. I ran downstairs, flinging open the front door, desperate for some sign of safety. The police were standing on my porch, flashlights in hand, looking confused. "There's no one here," one of the officers said, his brow furrowed. "We searched the property. It's empty." I shook my head, pointing towards the trees. They were out there. They were knocking. They tried to get in. The officer glanced at his partner, then back at me. "No one's been here. The doors are locked. The windows are secure. There's no sign of anyone trying to break in." The police left after searching the property, leaving me standing alone in the darkened house. They didn't believe me. How could they? The windows were intact, the doors locked, and there wasn't a single footprint or sign that anyone had ever been there. To them, I was just another jittery city dweller, spooked by the isolation of rural life. But I knew what I had seen, and worse, I knew what I had heard. I locked every door, pulled every curtain tight, and sat in the living room. The silence pressed in around me. My heart still raced, my mind replaying the sound of those knocks, the soft turn of the door handle. I could almost feel it again, that sense of something or someone waiting just outside, watching. I tried to sleep, but the night stretched on, every creak of the house making me jump. I kept telling myself it was over, that the police had scared off whoever or whatever had been out there. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't scared anything away. They just hadn't seen it yet. Around 2 a.m., I heard the first knock. I froze. My pulse quickened, my breath catching in my throat. It wasn't a loud knock, not like before. It was softer, as if whoever or whatever was outside wasn't in any rush, like they had all the time in the world. I sat up, heart racing, but I didn't move. I didn't dare go to the window. The knock came again, louder this time. The sound echoed through the house, slow and deliberate. Then came another knock from the back door. They were circling the house again. I stumbled to my feet, my hands trembling. My phone was on the coffee table, but I knew calling the police again wouldn't help. They hadn't found anything last time, and they wouldn't find anything this time either. The knocking grew more insistent, faster, moving from one window to the next. Each knock felt like a hammer blow to my nerves, the tension winding tighter with every second. I pressed my back against the wall, my eyes darting toward the kitchen. The back door handle rattled, just like it had before. My mind raced. I had to do something, anything, to make it stop. I grabbed the note from the kitchen table, the one I had crumpled earlier. My eyes scanned the words again. Don't stay out after dark. They arrive when the sun sets. I hadn't been outside, but it didn't seem to matter anymore. I was already in their sights. The knocking stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed was almost worse. The air felt heavy, suffocating, like the house itself was holding its breath. I stood frozen, waiting, listening. Then I heard something. A whisper. Faint, just outside the window. I couldn't make out the words, but it was there. Just on the other side of the glass, close enough that I could almost feel it. And then the handle on the front door began to turn. I didn't think. I grabbed my keys and bolted for the back door, throwing it open and sprinting into the yard. The cold night air hit me like a wall, but I didn't stop. I ran, my feet pounding against the uneven ground, through the overgrown grass, and toward my car parked at the edge of the property. Behind me, I heard the door creak open. I didn't look back. Fumbling with my keys, I threw myself into the car, slamming the door shut behind me. My hands shook as I jammed the key into the ignition, and the engine roared to life. I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see something, but the yard was empty. The house stood dark and still, like nothing had happened at all. But I knew better. The air in the car felt thick, heavy with the lingering presence of whatever had been in that house. I peeled out of the driveway, the tires skidding on the gravel, and didn't stop driving until I was miles away, until the house was nothing but a memory in the darkness. The next morning, I returned. The house looked the same, quiet, abandoned, as if it had never held any secrets. But when I stepped onto the porch, something caught my eye. There was another note taped to the front door. My hands trembled as I peeled it off, the paper worn and yellowed like the others. But this one was different. You can't outrun us. I left the house for good that day. I didn't care about the repairs, or the time, or the money I'd spent. I just wanted to get as far away as possible. But no matter where I go, I hear them now. At night, when the sun sets, I hear the knocking. Sometimes faint, sometimes louder, always closer than before. I've tried ignoring it, moving from place to place, but it doesn't matter. It follows me. And every night, I find the same note waiting. You can't outrun us. I don't know how long I can keep running, but I know one thing. Wherever I go, they'll be waiting. It was a last-minute decision to go to the estate auction. My friend Greg had insisted I join him, saying that these kind of events were gold mines for finding rare antiques, old books, or odd trinkets. I wasn't much into collecting, but Greg had a way of getting me involved in things I normally wouldn't consider. So there I was on a dreary Saturday morning, standing in front of an old mansion with a group of collectors and curious bidders. The house belonged to a man named Victor Halloway, an eccentric recluse who had passed away a few months earlier. From what I'd heard, he had no family, no close friends, and left behind a vast collection of bizarre items. The estate auction was the final chapter of his life, an opportunity for strangers to sift through his belongings, searching for treasure. The auction itself was as ordinary as they come. Furniture, paintings, old clocks, silverware, and even a few dusty trunks were lined up for bidding. I had no real intention of buying anything, but as the auction went on, something caught my eye. It was a box, wooden, intricately carved, and about the size of a small suitcase. It sat on a table near the back, almost unnoticed. There was something about the craftsmanship that drew me to it, though I couldn't explain why. The carvings were strange, geometric patterns, swirling and intersecting in a way that made the box seem almost alive. When it was time to bid on the box, no one else seemed interested. Greg nudged me, telling me to go for it, and, without much thought, I did. I won it for $50, which felt like a steal for something so unique. Maybe there's treasure hidden inside, Greg joked as we loaded it into my car. I laughed, but as I placed the box in the back seat, I felt a strange sense of satisfaction, like I'd found something important, something that was waiting for me. Back home, I set the box on my coffee table, staring at it for a while. The carvings were even more intricate than I had first noticed, almost mesmerizing. I tried to open it, but the lid wouldn't budge. There was no lock, no latch, just a perfectly sealed box. I examined it closer, running my fingers over the carvings. As I traced one of the swirling patterns, I felt a faint click. The top of the box shifted slightly. I lifted the lid, and it opened smoothly. Inside, there was no treasure, no gold coins or hidden jewels. Instead, there was a single envelope, yellowed with age, and a small, tarnished key. The envelope was addressed simply as, "To the owner." Curiosity got the best of me. I opened the envelope, expecting to find some kind of explanation. Instead, I found a single piece of paper with a short, typed message. "Do not use the key. Once turned, it cannot be undone." I stared at the note, frowning. What was this supposed to mean? Use the key for what? There were no locks in the box, no compartments or secret drawers, just the key, sitting innocuously at the bottom of the box. Greg called later that night to ask about the box, and when I told him about the note, he laughed it off. "It's probably some kind of joke," he said, "a gimmick to make the box more interesting. You should try using the key." I was skeptical, but after we hung up, I found myself holding the key, turning it over in my hands. It was small and unremarkable, the kind of key you'd expect to find in an old lockbox or a jewelry chest. The more I looked at it, the more I wanted to know what it unlocked. The next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about the key. I searched the box over and over, trying to find some hidden lock or mechanism, but there was nothing. Still, the warning in the notes stuck with me. One night, after a very restless evening, I gave in. I picked up the key and studied it again. The message seemed like nonsense, and I was tired of the mystery. Maybe the key had nothing to do with the box at all. Maybe it unlocked something else entirely. After all, old houses like the Holloway Mansion often had secret compartments or hidden rooms. I had nothing to lose, so I decided to see if the key fit any of the locks in my own house. It was on the third try that the key found its place. I was surprised when it slid easily into the lock on the door to the basement. The door had always been stiff, the kind you had to shove open with your shoulder, but now it moved smoothly as I turned the key. I hesitated, remembering the note's warning, but curiosity is a powerful thing, and I'd come too far to stop now. With a deep breath, I turned the key. The lock clicked. I pushed open the door and descended down the stairs, the air growing cooler as I went. My basement was unfinished, concrete floors, exposed beams, the usual clutter of old boxes and forgotten things. But tonight it felt different. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, and the silence was oppressive. I stepped forward, holding my phone's flashlight up to see better. There was nothing out of the ordinary at first, just the same basement I'd been in a dozen times before. And then I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible hum. It was coming from the far corner of the basement, near a pile of old furniture I hadn't touched since I moved in. The sound was low, steady, like the faint buzz of electricity. I moved closer, my pulse quickening. The hum grew louder, filling the basement with an unsettling vibration. I reached the far corner, my hand trembling as I lifted the flashlight higher. There, buried under an old tarp, was another door. I had never noticed it before. The door was made of dark wood, the same swirling patterns from the box carved into its surface. My heart pounded as I reached for the handle. I knew I shouldn't, but something urged me forward. I had already come this far. I turned the handle. The door swung open easily, revealing a narrow, dark passageway. The hum intensified, vibrating through the walls, through my body, filling my mind with a growing sense of dread. I took a step inside, the cold air wrapping around me like a shroud. And then I saw it. It wasn't treasure, it wasn't answers. It was me. Standing at the end of the passageway was a figure identical to me in every way. Same clothes, same face, same terrified expression. It stood perfectly still, staring back at me with wide, empty eyes. I stumbled back, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The figure didn't move, didn't blink. It just watched, its expression frozen in an eerie reflection of my own. I ran. I slammed the basement door behind me, locking it with the key, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the lock. The hum had stopped, but the silence was worse. The box sat on the coffee table, the note still lying beside it. Once turned, it cannot be undone. I should have listened. Now, every night, I hear the hum, louder and closer. And I know that whatever I let out of the basement is waiting for me to make the next move. It had been years since I last saw Jeff, and when his invitation came through to attend his birthday party, I was surprised. We'd been close back in college, practically inseparable, but drifted apart once life got busy. Jobs, relationships, and eventually moving to different cities. So when I received the message, I wasn't sure what made him think of me after all this time, but I figured it was a chance to reconnect. His text was oddly vague. Come to my birthday party next weekend, Saturday at 8 p.m. It'll be something different. He included the address, but didn't provide many details. He also emphasized, be on time. I thought it was a little weird. Jeff had never been one to worry about punctuality, especially for his parties. But I shrugged it off, assuming he'd just changed over the years. Saturday night came, and I decided to go. I wasn't doing much else, and figured it might be fun to see him again, maybe catch up on old times. The address he sent was unfamiliar, though tucked away in a part I didn't know well, on the outskirts, far away from any places we'd hung out before. As I drove, the streets became more isolated. Streetlights grew sparser, and the houses were spaced farther apart, swallowed by trees and darkness. There was something unsettling about the area, the kind of place where you're unsure whether you've taken a wrong turn. But I kept going, following my GPS, which eventually led me to a long, winding road that stretched out into the country. Finally I saw it, an old, sprawling house, its windows faintly glowing against the inky black night. I pulled into the gravel driveway, noticing there weren't many cars parked around, only 2 in fact. For a birthday party, it seemed strange. Maybe everyone else had parked elsewhere, I reasoned, or maybe they were running late. But Jeff had been so adamant about being on time, I figured I'd just gotten there early. The house was huge, far bigger than I'd imagined. It looked like something out of another century, an old Victorian mansion with tall windows, intricate wood trim, and a grand arched doorway. It wasn't what I expected from Jeff at all. I knew he had done well for himself over the years, but this seemed too extravagant, too old-fashioned for someone who'd always been more laid-back and modern. I stepped out of the car, feeling the chill in the air. The night was quiet, too quiet. The only sound was the crunch of gravel under my feet as I approached the front door. There were no voices, no music, no signs of a party. I knocked. The door opened slowly, revealing a man I didn't recognize. He was tall, with sharp features and dressed in an old-fashioned black suit, the kind you'd see in period dramas. His face was pale, his expression blank. For a second, I thought I had the wrong house. I'm here for Jeff's party, I said, holding up a bottle of wine I'd brought. The man looked over me for a moment, his eyes flickering to the bottle, then back to me. Without saying a word, he stepped aside and gestured for me to come in. I hesitated. Something about him unsettled me, but before I could say anything, he spoke, his voice low and cold. "Of course, come in." I stepped inside, feeling a strange heaviness in the air. The door closed behind me with a soft, deliberate thud. The entryway was grand, dark wood paneling, a massive chandelier overhead, and a staircase that curved up into shadows. But despite the grandeur, the house felt wrong. The lights were dim, and the air was thick, almost suffocating. No sounds of laughter or chatter, just silence. "The others are in the drawing room," the man said, his tone devoid of any warmth. He turned and started walking down a hallway, expecting me to follow. I did, but unease began gnawing at me. Who were these others, and why wasn't Jeff there to greet me? We passed through several rooms, all decorated with heavy curtains, antique furniture, and thick rugs that muffled our footsteps. It felt like stepping into another era. There was something eerie about the stillness of the house, the way the candlelight flickered but cast no real warmth. I kept expecting to hear music or voices, but it was disturbingly quiet. Finally, we reached a set of double doors. The man pushed them open, revealing a large drawing room. Inside, a small group of people sat in a circle. There were about 8 or 9 of them, all dressed in the same old-fashioned clothes as the man who had greeted me. Some wore long, flowing dresses. Others had suits that looked like they belonged in a different century. They sat motionless, their faces expressionless. I scanned the room, but Jeff was nowhere to be seen. "Welcome," a woman said, rising from her chair. Her voice was soft, almost musical, but there was no warmth in it. She was pale, with dark hair pinned up in an elegant style. She wore a long, antiquated gown. "You're just in time. Please, sit." I felt my heart began to race. This wasn't right. This wasn't Jeff's party. These people, whoever they were, felt wrong, like they didn't belong in this time. I glanced around, searching for a polite way to excuse myself. "Is Jeff around?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "I think I'm at the wrong place." The woman smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "There's no mistake. We've been expecting you." The air in the room seemed to grow colder. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but something about the way she said it, "We've been expecting you," sent a chill down my spine. I took a step back towards the door, ready to leave, but the man who had brought me here was standing in the doorway, blocking my exit. My heart pounded. "I think I should go," I stammered, taking another step back. The woman's smile widened, but it was hollow. "You can't leave. Not yet. The ritual hasn't begun." Ritual? My mouth went dry. I turned to leave, but the man in the doorway didn't move. I felt trapped, the air around me growing heavier. The others in the room still hadn't moved from their seats, but I could still feel their eyes on me, cold and unblinking. I bolted for a side door, pushing past the nearest chair, but before I could reach it, I heard the scraping sounds of chairs being pushed back. The group was standing now, their movements slow and deliberate, as if they had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times. Their faces remained expressionless, but there was a strange hunger in their eyes. I yanked the door open and ran. The house was a maze of hallways, each one darker and more oppressive than the last. I could hear their footsteps behind me, calm, steady, as though they knew I couldn't escape. I ran through rooms that seemed to twist and turn in ways that defied logic, each one filled with more of the same old, antique furniture and eerie candlelight. Finally, I stumbled into the kitchen, breathing hard. My hands shook as I looked around, desperate for a way out. Then I saw it, a back door, slightly ajar. I didn't think. I ran to it, yanked it open, and sprinted into the night air. The cold hit me like a slap, but I didn't stop. I ran toward my car, my pulse pounding in my ears. Behind me, I could hear nothing but the rustle of leaves and the distant creak of the house settling. No footsteps, no voices. I jumped into the car, fumbling with the keys, and started the engine. As I backed out of the driveway, I risked a glance at the house. The group stood on the porch, watching me. Their faces were still blank, still expressionless, but there was something behind their eyes, something dark and waiting. I sped away, my heart hammering in my chest, and I didn't stop driving until I was miles away. The next morning, I tried to contact Jeff. I called, texted, even looked him up online, but I couldn't find him. His social media accounts were gone, and no one seemed to know where he was. It was as if he disappeared completely. A few days later, I returned to the address, just to see if maybe I'd been mistaken. Maybe I'd gone to the wrong place. But when I arrived, there was nothing there. The house, the driveway, everything. It was just an empty field. I haven't heard from Jeff since. But sometimes, late at night, I get a text from an unknown number. "We're still waiting for you." I don't respond, but I know they're still out there, waiting. And one day, I'm afraid they'll find me. My friend Riley was the type who loved urban legends, horror movies, and anything that gave her a thrill. So, when she found out about the elevator game, a supposed ritual to visit another world, she was immediately obsessed. I shrugged it off as another one of her spooky obsessions, the kind she'd eventually get bored of. But Riley was different this time. She was dead set on playing it, and, naturally, she wanted me to come along. "You really believe this?" I asked her when she first mentioned it. Riley just grinned, that mischievous spark in her eye. "Don't you want to know what happens? Aren't you even a little curious?" I wasn't, really, but her excitement was contagious, and by the end of the conversation, she'd somehow convinced me to go along with it. The rules of the game were simple but specific. You needed a building with at least 10 floors and an elevator that wouldn't be interrupted by other people entering. You entered a certain sequence of floors in a specific order, and, supposedly, when you reached the 10th floor, a doorway to another world would open. It sounded ridiculous, but Riley was convinced. We agreed to meet up on a Friday night and head to an old office building downtown that she scoped out. It was mostly abandoned and rarely used, which made it the perfect spot. I brought a flashlight just in case and a thermos of coffee to get us through what I expected would be a very dull night. When we arrived, the building was as empty as she'd said it would be. The lobby lights were dim, casting long shadows across the marble floors. The place smelled stale, like dust and cold metal. The air felt thick, almost like the building was holding its breath, waiting. "You ready?" Riley asked, her eyes wide with excitement. "Let's just get this over with," I muttered. We stepped into the elevator, and Riley pressed the button for the 4th floor, the starting point of the sequence. From there, she began the ritual, moving from the 4th floor to the 2nd, to the 6th, and so on. I tried not to laugh as she punched each button with a dramatic flourish. As we reached the final floor, the elevator stopped, and I prepared to step out, expecting nothing but an empty hallway. But Riley grabbed my arm. "No, this is it, the final step." She pressed the button for the 10th floor. The elevator shuddered slightly and then began its ascent. I rolled my eyes, fully expecting this to end like every other ghost story Riley had dragged me into, anticlimactically. But as the elevator climbed, the temperature seemed to drop. By the time we passed the 7th floor, I could see my breath fogging the air. Did the AC just kick on? I asked, feeling uneasy. Riley just looked at me, her face pale. For once, she wasn't smiling. The elevator stopped at the 10th floor, and for a second, everything was silent. Then, with a soft chime, the doors slid open. Beyond the elevator doors was the hallway. At first glance, it looked the same as the lobby, a long corridor with faded carpet and peeling paint. But there was something off. The light fixtures overhead flickered dimly, casting shadows that seemed to writhe along the walls. The air smelled musty, like old books and something faintly metallic, almost like blood. "This is it," Riley whispered. Her voice sounded far away. She stepped out of the elevator, her movements slow, almost dreamlike. I hesitated, every instinct telling me to stay inside, to let the doors close and take me back to the familiar, safe first floor. But I couldn't leave her, so I followed her out, the elevator doors sliding shut behind us with a faint hiss. The hallway stretched out before us, impossibly long, much longer than it had looked from inside the elevator. As we walked, I noticed that each door we pressed had no numbers, no labels, just blank doors with tarnished handles. We stopped in front of one of them, and Riley reached out to touch the doorknob. I grabbed her arm, stopping her. "Riley, we should go back. This doesn't feel right." She looked at me, her face pale, her eyes wide. "Don't you feel it? This is real, Sam. This place isn't normal." I shivered, feeling an icy chill seep into my bones. She was right. Everything about this place felt wrong, like it was hollowed out, waiting. And in the silence, I could hear something. A faint, distant hum, like machinery far below us, turning and grinding. "Let's just go back," I said, trying to pull her away. But Riley shook me off. She was fixated on the door, her hand reaching for the handle. Before I could stop her, she opened it. Inside the room was darkness, just an endless black void that seemed to swallow up the light from the hallway. Riley took a step forward, peering inside, and I could see the strange fascination on her face. "Riley, don't," I started, but it was too late. She stepped into the room. The moment her foot crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. I lunged forward, grabbing the handle, but it wouldn't budge. I pounded the door, shouting her name, panic crawling at my throat. "Riley! Riley, open the door!" There was no answer, just the silence, thick and heavy. Desperately, I scanned the hallway, looking for any other way to find her, to get her back. But every door was locked, every handle cold and unyielding. I ran back to the elevator and pounded the call button, praying it would come, that I could get help. After what felt like an eternity, the doors slid open. I jumped inside, slamming my hand against the button for the first floor, my heart racing. As the elevator doors began to close, I glanced back down the hallway. Riley was standing there, at the end of the corridor, staring at me. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and unblinking. Her mouth hung open, her expression frozen in terror. She didn't move, she just watched me, her gaze hollow and empty. "Riley?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The doors slid shut, cutting her off from view, and the elevator began its descent. I returned to the lobby, sprinting outside to call the police. I told them about the abandoned building, about Riley disappearing, and about the strange door. They arrived quickly, bringing in backup and even firefighters, prepared to search every floor. But when we returned to the 10th floor, it was just a normal hallway. The endless corridor was gone, replaced by a short, dingy stretch of carpeting with numbered doors that led to empty rooms. There was no sign of Riley, no sign of the door she had gone through. The police searched every inch of the building, but it was as if she'd vanished into thin air. Months passed, and I did everything I could to find Riley. I contacted the police, psychics, paranormal investigators, anyone who might be able to help, but there was no sign of her, and no one could explain what had happened. Most people stopped believing me, assuming Riley had just left town without saying goodbye, but I knew what I saw. Then, about 6 months later, I got a call in the middle of the night. Half asleep, I answered, and all I heard was static. But in between the crackling, I could make out faint whispers, 2 words over and over. Come back. I hung up, my heart pounding. I tried to tell myself it was a wrong number, a glitch. But the calls just kept coming, sometimes in the dead of night, sometimes just as I was about to fall asleep. The static, the whispers, that same message. Then, one night, as I lay in bed, my phone rang again. I let it ring, but the whispers started, louder this time, insistent. Against my better judgment, I picked it up. I'm still here. The call cut off, leaving me in silence. Now, every time I close my eyes, I see her face in the darkness, her hollow eyes staring back at me. And sometimes, when I walk past an elevator, I swear I hear that faint, rhythmic hum behind the doors. It's waiting, just like she is, for the next time I press the button. When my family moved to the countryside, we were all excited about a fresh start. We found a charming old farmhouse surrounded by rolling fields, the kind of place you only see in picture books. It was quiet, secluded, and seemed like the perfect spot for my parents to live out their dream of raising animals and planting gardens. It didn't take long for us to settle in, filling the house with laughter and the smells of home-cooked meals. But there was one thing that felt off from the very beginning: the Scarecrow. It stood in the middle of the field just behind our house, a tattered thing with straw poking out of its burlap sack head and a faded flannel shirt hanging off its stick-thin frame. Its hat was old, torn at the brim, and from the back porch you could make out its hollow eyes, 2 black pits that seemed to watch over the land. I asked my dad about it on our first day here, but he just shrugged, saying it came with the property. Probably been here for years, he said, ruffling my hair. Good to have something keeping an eye on things out there. I laughed it off and tried to ignore it. After all, scarecrows were just a part of life on a farm, right? But as the weeks went on, I noticed something strange. Every morning, the scarecrow seemed to be facing a different direction. Sometimes it looked towards the house, other times it was angled toward the road, and once it even appeared to be turned directly toward my bedroom window. I figured it was just the wind shifting it, or maybe the birds messing with it, but no matter how many times I tried to tell myself that, a creeping unease started to settle in. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, I looked out my window and froze. There, standing in the field, was the scarecrow, facing directly toward my window, its empty eyes fixed on me. I stared at it, feeling my skin crawl, and pulled the curtains shut, trying to shake off the feeling that it was watching me. The next morning, I mentioned it to my mom, but she just laughed. Honey, it's just a scarecrow. They're supposed to be a little creepy, right? I tried to brush it off, to act like it didn't bother me, but as the days passed, things only got stranger. One evening, as the sun was setting, I went outside to help my dad with some yard work. I glanced over at the scarecrow and felt my stomach drop. It had moved closer to the house. Just a few feet, but I was sure it hadn't been that close before. I didn't say anything, not wanting to sound paranoid, but I could feel its hollow gaze following me as I worked. That night, I woke up to a sound outside my window. It was faint, like the rustling of leaves, but more deliberate. I held my breath, listened as the sound grew louder, closer. Slowly, I got out of bed and pulled the curtain back, peeking out into the darkness. The scarecrow was gone. I blinked, thinking maybe I was seeing things, but no matter how hard I looked, it wasn't there. The field was empty, the moonlight casting long shadows across the grass. Heart pounding, I crept downstairs, hoping my dad was still awake, but as I reached the kitchen, I stopped dead in my tracks. There, just outside the back door, stood the scarecrow. Its head was tilted to the side, as if it were studying me, its empty eyes glinting in the faint light. Straw jutted out from the rips in its clothes, and its twisted mouth seemed to form a strange, lopsided grin. I backed away slowly, feeling a cold sweat break across my skin. I ran back upstairs, locking my door, and spent the rest of the night wide awake, listening for any sounds from outside. But the house was silent, the only noise my own ragged breathing. In the morning, the Scarecrow was back in its usual spot in the field, facing away from the house. I tried to convince myself it had just been a nightmare. Maybe I was letting my imagination get the better of me. But that day, I noticed something new, a set of footprints in the dirt, leading me from the field to our back door. They were small, just the size of my own feet, and they left a trail of crushed grass and broken twigs. That night, I locked all the doors and windows, feeling my pulse race as I double-checked each lock. But in the middle of the night, I heard it again, the rustling outside my window, soft and slow. And then a new sound, a soft tap, tap, tapping at my window. I lay frozen, listening as the tapping grew louder, more insistent, each knock sending a shiver down my spine. Gathering my courage, I glanced toward the window, heart racing. There, pressed against the glass, was the face of the Scarecrow. Its burlap sack head was tilted to the side, the hollow eyes staring straight into mine. Its mouth was twisted in the same unsettling grin, and the hat hung low over its straw-stuffed head. It was waiting. I stumbled back, scrambling to lock my door, trying to tell myself it wasn't real. But the tapping continued, soft and rhythmic, like it knew I was there, like it knew I couldn't ignore it. In the morning, the Scarecrow was back in the field. I tried to tell my parents, tried to explain that something was wrong, that something wasn't right with the Scarecrow, but they just brushed it off, telling me I was being silly, that I was letting my imagination get the best of me. But I know what I saw. And every night, I still hear the tapping at my window, soft and insistent. Each morning, the Scarecrow is back in the field, closer than when it was before. And every time I look at it, I can swear its twisted smile is just a little wider. When I was a kid, Halloween was the highlight of my year. Every October, my friends and I would run through the neighborhood in our costumes, filling our bags with candy, trading treats, and daring each other to go to the creepiest houses on the block. But there was one house none of us would go near, the old ivy-covered cottage at the end of Willow Lane. The house belonged to a woman everyone called the Candy Witch. I don't remember who first gave her that name, but it stuck. She was an elderly woman who rarely left her house, and, on Halloween, she left a bowl of candy on her front porch with the sign that read, "Take only one, or else." I didn't know anyone who had taken her candy, let alone anyone who had dared to take more than one piece. Rumor had it that if you took more than one, the Candy Witch would come for you in the night. The next morning, you'd be gone, vanished without a trace. Kids told stories of seeing her shadowy figure on Halloween night, watching her from darkened windows. I never believed in the stories. I figured she was just a lonely old lady who got a bad reputation because of her spooky house. But when Halloween came around and I saw that bowl on her porch with its threatening sign, even I felt a shiver of fear. That Halloween, my friend Max dared me to grab a handful of her candy. "Come on, Ryan," he whispered, grinning as we stood at the end of her driveway. "You're not scared of some old witch, are you?" "I'm not scared," I replied, trying to sound braver than I felt. "But I'm not stupid either." "Oh, come on," Max scoffed, rolling his eyes. "It's just candy. What's the worst that could happen?" He gave me a playful shove, and before I knew it, I was walking up the porch steps, my heart pounding. The bowl of candies sat on a rickety old table, overflowing with brightly colored sweets, some of which looked homemade. Oddly shaped chocolates, sugar-dusted caramels, and dark licorice sticks. The sign was perched above the bowl, its message clear in scrawled, looping letters, "Take only one, or else." My mouth went dry. I reached out, my hand hovering over the candy, hesitating. Do it, Max hissed from the end of the driveway, snickering. I grabbed one piece, then glanced back at him, feeling a surge of defiance. I grabbed another, then another, stuffing a small handful into my bag. For a moment, nothing happened. I took a deep breath, my heart still pounding, and started to walk back towards Max, feeling a little braver. But as I turned, a cold, soft voice whispered from behind me, "That was a mistake, Ryan." I spun around, but the porch was empty. My heart was pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else. I looked around, my eyes darting across the shadows, but no one was there. Max laughed, oblivious to my fear, and we sprinted down the street, stuffing our bags with candy from the other houses, trading horror stories as we went. I tried to push the candy witch's voice out of my mind, telling myself it was just my imagination. That night, after trick-or-treating was over, I dumped my haul of candy onto my bedroom floor, inspecting each piece. But there, mixed among the familiar treats, were the sweets I had taken from her porch. They looked even stranger now in the light. Dark chocolates with tiny cracks running through them, licorice sticks twisted like little spirals, and a small, round candy wrapped in faded paper. I unwrapped it, staring at the strange candy in my hand. It looked like no candy I'd ever seen before. Deep purple, almost black, with a sticky sheen that made my fingers feel numb. For some reason, I couldn't bring myself to throw it away, so I left it on my nightstand and went to bed, trying to ignore the creeping sense of dread. Around midnight, I was woken up by a noise. It was faint, like someone whispering my name from far away. My room was pitch black, but my eyes adjusted, and I saw something that made my heart stop. A shadowy figure was standing at the foot of my bed. I couldn't see her face, but I knew. I knew it was her, the Candy Witch. She stood there, her figure tall and thin, her head cocked to the side as if studying me. I wanted to scream, to move, to run, but my body felt frozen. "Didn't you read the sign, Ryan?" she whispered, her voice cold and hollow. "I warned you." I felt a wave of terror wash over me as she reached out, her hand impossibly long and thin, her fingers curling toward me. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move, couldn't even close my eyes. And then, just as her hand reached me, she was gone. I gasped, sitting up in my bed, my body covered in a cold sweat. My room was empty. The candy I had taken from her bowl lay scattered across the floor, my trick-or-treat bag torn open, the sweets spilling out. But the strange candy, the one I had left on my nightstand, was gone. The next day at school, I told Max what had happened. He just laughed, thinking I was trying to spook him. But that night, he called me, his voice trembling. "She came to my room last night," he whispered. "I thought I heard her say my name." Over the next few days, I tried to forget about the Candy Witch, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she was watching me. Every night, I felt her presence in my room, lingering in the shadows, just out of sight. Then, a week later, Max disappeared. His parents thought he'd run away, but I knew the truth. She'd come for him. He laughed it off, ignored her warning, and now he was gone. And that's when the notes started. Every Halloween since, I've woken up to a piece of faded paper on my nightstand, written in the same looping script. "You owe me, Ryan. One day I'll come to collect." Now, every Halloween night, I lie awake, barely daring to breathe, waiting for the cold whisper and the shadowy figure at the foot of my bed. I know she hasn't forgotten, and I know she'll be back. When I was 12, a new mask shop opened in our town just before Halloween. The store was small, tucked away between two boarded-up buildings on a forgotten stretch of road, and it didn't even have a sign. But the window display was enough to catch my attention. Dozens of masks, each one unique, each one more lifelike and unsettling than the last. Some were grotesque, with twisted features and hollow eyes. Others were so detailed that I almost expected them to blink. My friends and I were instantly drawn to it. Halloween was just around the corner, and this new shop felt like it had appeared just for us. We pushed open the door and stepped inside, the air thick with a strange, sweet smell, like old candy and wood polish. Behind the counter stood an elderly man, tall and thin, with eyes that seemed too sharp and intense for someone his age. He smiled at us, a slow, crooked grin, and beckoned us inside. Welcome, welcome, he said in a voice that sounded like creaking floorboards. Each mask is one of a kind. They don't just transform your face, but your spirit. We laughed nervously, thinking he was just trying to make a sale. But as we looked around the shop, examining each mask, we couldn't shake the feeling that there was something alive about them. The eyes seemed to follow us, the expressions shifting ever so slightly when we weren't looking directly at them. Go ahead, try one on, the man encouraged, his smile widening. Choose wisely, though. The mask chooses you as much as you choose it. My friends and I split up, each of us wandering through the aisles. I found a mask that looked like a wolf's face, its teeth sharp and its eyes gleaming. There was a strange allure to it, and when I held it up to my face, it felt cool, almost cold, against my skin. Just then, I heard my friend Danny call out from the other aisle. Check this one out, it's creepy, she said, holding up a mask of a smiling clown, its face frozen in a disturbing, exaggerated grin. She slipped it on and giggled, making goofy faces at us. But the moment she put it on, her expression changed. She stopped laughing, her movements stiffening. She looked at us through the mask, her eyes wide, almost frantic. Danny? I said, feeling uneasy. She didn't respond. Instead, she began moving in jerky, unnatural motions, as though her body wasn't entirely her own. She looked into the mirror, tilting her head back and forth, her hand slowly reaching up to touch the mask. Danny, are you okay? Max asked, laughing nervously. He reached out to pull the mask off her face, but she slapped his hand away, hard, her eyes still wide and unblinking. Leave it on, she whispered, her voice soft but different. It didn't sound like Danny at all. It was higher, childlike, with a twisted edge to it. We all stared at her, confused and a little freaked out. She wouldn't let any of us near her, standing there, staring at herself in the mirror with that same frozen expression. Then, just as suddenly as she'd put it on, she pulled the mask off, her eyes wide and her face pale. I don't know what just happened, she whispered, clutching the mask in her hands like it was something she couldn't bear to let go of. The old man watched us, his eyes gleaming with a strange satisfaction. Sometimes the mask reveals a part of you didn't know was there, he said softly, as if explaining some grand, unsettling truth. We exchanged uneasy glances, each of us a little shaken. But there was something almost magnetic about the masks. Despite what had happened to Danny, none of us wanted to leave without one. One by one, we each found a mask that called to us. Max picked a sinister-looking jester with a twisted smile and eyes that glinted with a mischievous sparkle. Lily chose a fox mask, sly and elegant, its features sharp and cunning. I couldn't resist the wolf mask, even after what had happened to Danny. Something about it felt right. The man handed us each a brown paper bag to put our masks in, and as we paid, he gave us a final warning. Remember, he said, his voice low, once you wear the mask on Halloween night, it's yours, forever. We laughed it off, thinking it was just his way of adding a bit of Halloween mystery. But that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that his words were meant as more than just a scare. Halloween arrived, and we were all excited to wear our masks. As we gathered in the street, each of us slipped on our chosen mask. The transformation was instant. I felt a surge of energy, wild and exhilarating, as if the mask had unlocked something hidden within me. My senses felt sharper, my movements more agile, like I could leap and bound through the night with the instincts of a predator. But as the night went on, something changed. I began to feel trapped, like the mask was tightening around my face, refusing to let go. My friends were acting strange too. Max's laughter grew louder, more manic, echoing down the streets as he performed wild, exaggerated movements. Lily moved with a quiet grace, almost too graceful, her eyes darting around as if she was looking for prey. Danny, with her clown mask, simply stood still, her head tilted, her eyes staring at something none of us could see. When I reached out to pull my mask off, I found that it wouldn't budge. The edges felt like they had melted into my skin, becoming a part of me. "Guys," I said, panic creeping into my voice, I can't take mine off." Max laughed, but there was no warmth in it. His eyes gleamed through the jester mask, his mouth twisted in a grin that looked too wide, too forced. "Isn't it fun, though?" he whispered, his voice a distorted echo of his own. One by one, we all realized the same thing. The masks were no longer just costumes. They were us. I could feel the wolf within me, growling and clawing, urging me to run, to hunt. I looked at my friends, each of them lost in their own mask, their own twisted identity. We tried everything to remove them, clawing at the edges, pulling until our skin burned, but the masks wouldn't come off. They had become our faces, our identities, binding us to the roles we'd chosen. In the distance, I thought I saw the old man standing at the edge of the street, watching us, his crooked smile visible even from afar. I tried to scream, to call out to him, but only a low, feral growl escaped my throat. As the clock struck midnight, we were still wandering the streets, our faces twisted into the masks that we could never remove. And as Halloween faded into the night, I understood the old man's final words. The mask wasn't just a costume, it was who we had become, and it was forever. In my town, Halloween was celebrated with a huge festival every year. People would decorate their houses, dress up, and carve jack-o'-lanterns to place on their porches. But there was one tradition everyone followed without question: the jack-o'-lantern rule. Never leave your jack-o'-lantern unlit on Halloween night. The rule had been around for as long as anyone could remember, and no one really knew where it came from, but everyone followed it, no matter what. Some people said that if you left your jack-o'-lantern unlit on Halloween night, you'd invite something unwelcome into your home. Most people brushed it off as just an old superstition, but no one dared to test it. One Halloween, my friend Oliver and I were out trick-or-treating, getting as much candy as we could before the festival started. We got to Oliver's house. We noticed his jack-o'-lantern was sitting on the porch, its grin wide and sinister, but the candle inside had burned out. "Hey, aren't you supposed to keep that lit?" I asked, nudging him. Oliver shrugged, laughing. "It's just an old story. Nothing's going to happen." He took out his lighter, but then paused, smirking. "Actually, why don't we see what happens?" I didn't like the idea. My parents had always warned me about the jack-o'-lantern rule, and even though I didn't believe in curses, something about the rules stuck with me. But Oliver was stubborn, and before I could say anything, he left the jack-o'-lantern dark and walked inside to drop off his candy. As we walked to the festival, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd made a mistake. The festival was lively, with music, games, and stalls lined with orange and black decorations. We had a great time, but as the night went on, I kept catching glimpses of something out of the corner of my eye. A dark figure, just barely visible in the crowd, watching us. Every time I looked, it was gone, but the uneasy feeling lingered. "Did you see that?" I whispered to Oliver, glancing over my shoulder. "See what?" he asked, distracted by a candy apple stall. I shook my head, telling myself it was nothing, but as we made our way home after the festival, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. When we reached Oliver's house, I glanced at the darkened jack-o'-lantern on his porch. Its carved grin seemed wider now, its eyes darker, deeper. Oliver laughed it off, making fun of me for being jumpy, and went inside. inside. I walked home, but the feeling of being watched stayed with me the entire way. That night, just as I was about to drift off to sleep, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Oliver. "You're not going to believe this. My jack-o'-lantern is back on, but I never relit it." I sat up, my heart pounding. I texted back, asking if he was messing with me. He replied with a picture. The jack-o'-lantern was sitting on his porch, its eyes and mouth glowing with an eerie, flickering light. But what unsettled me most was the shadow in the background of the picture. A tall, thin figure standing just behind the jack-o'-lantern, its face obscured, watching from the darkness. I tried calling him, but it went straight to voicemail. I texted him again, asking if he was okay, but there was no response. The next day, Oliver wasn't at school. I tried calling him, texting him, even stopping by his house, but no one answered the door. His parents were out of town, and it seemed like he'd just vanished. The only sign he'd been there was the jack-o'-lantern on his porch, still lit, still grinning that sinister grin. The police got involved, and the whole town was asking about his disappearance. Some people thought he'd run away, others thought it was some kind of prank, but I knew the truth. I remember the shadow in the photo, the feeling of being watched, the unlit jack-o'-lantern on his porch. A few nights later, I was lying in bed when I heard the faint scratching of sound outside my window. I froze, listening, my heart pounding. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, like someone or something was dragging sharp nails across the glass. Slowly, I turned to look, and there, on the other side of the window, was Oliver's jack-o'-lantern, its eyes and mouth flickering with a ghostly light. And standing beside it was the shadowy figure, tall and thin, its face twisted into a grin that matched the jack-o'-lantern's. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure raised a long, bony finger and tapped on the glass, its grin widening, its hollow eyes locked onto mine. The next morning, the jack-o'-lantern was gone. No one believed me when I told them about the shadow, about the jack-o'-lantern that had appeared at my window. But every Halloween since, as midnight approaches, I find a small pumpkin on my porch, uncarved with a single candle beside it, and I know what it means. Every Halloween, I light the candle, place it in the pumpkin, and make sure it stays burning all night. I'm too afraid to find out what happens if it goes out. Every Halloween in our town, there was a peculiar event known as the Ghost Parade. It wasn't an official celebration. No one knew who organized it, where it came from, or how it started. But every year, just after midnight, a parade of people in old-fashioned costumes would march down the main street. The air would fill with the faint sound of drums, creaking wheels, and hushed whispers as they passed. My friends and I always watched from our windows, terrified but intrigued. People said it was a tradition that honored the spirits who lived in our town long ago, and as long as you watched from a distance and kept quiet, you were safe. This Halloween, however, my curiosity got the best of me. My friend Sam dared me to go outside and watch the parade up close. We'd all heard stories, how if you got too close, the spirits would notice you and might even drag you into their world. But as the night went on and the whispering drums began to echo down the street, I felt a surge of courage. "It's just a bunch of people in costumes, right?" I whispered, grinning at Sam. Probably just the older folks keeping some spooky tradition going. Sam tried to stop me, but I ignored him and slipped out the front door, creeping towards the main street where the parade would soon pass. I crouched in the shadows, feeling my heart race as the first figures appeared in the distance, marching in slow, deliberate steps. The parade was unlike anything I'd ever seen. The figures were dressed in clothes from centuries past, worn coats, long skirts, cloaks, and masks that covered their faces. Their faces looked painted, gaunt and pale, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare into the distance, unseeing. Some wore tattered hats, others carried old lanterns or boutiques of wilting flowers. A few children marched with them, clutching broken dolls or faded teddy bears. It was eerie, yes, but they all looked so real. Too real. As they passed, I felt a chill settle over me, colder than the autumn night, creeping into my bones. I tried to keep my breathing steady, staying hidden in the shadows, but then one of them stopped, an old man in a black coat and top hat. He lifted his head, sniffing the air, his eyes empty, scanning the darkness around him. I froze, watching him, and suddenly his gaze locked onto me. My blood ran cold as he tilted his head, his eyes narrowing, a twisted smile forming on his pale face. He pointed a long, bony finger in my direction, and slowly the other figures turned to look at me, their hollow stares piercing through the darkness. Panicked, I stepped back, my foot catching on a stone, and I stumbled. The soft whispers turned to hisses, the drumming growing louder and faster. I scrambled to my feet, turning to run back to my house, but the parade was moving now, toward me. I bolted, but the sound of footsteps followed me, closing in. I could hear the voices, murmuring, whispering words I couldn't understand. My heart pounded as I reached my front door, slamming it shut behind me. I leaned against the door, panting, but the whispers were still there, just outside. I peered through the people, and to my horror, there were gathered in front of my house, staring at my door with empty, hollow eyes. The figure in the black coat stepped forward, his fingers still pointed at me. He opened his mouth, and a low, rasping voice whispered through the door, "You broke the rules." I backed away, but the whispers grew louder, echoing through my house. Shadows danced across the walls, stretching and twisting, and the temperature dropped until I could see my breath in the air. I ran to my room, hiding under the covers, but the whispers didn't stop. They filled every corner of the house, surrounding me, suffocating me. The air felt thick, heavy, and the walls seemed to close in around me. The next morning, I woke up on the floor, the room silent and cold. I tried to shake off the fear, telling myself it had been a nightmare. But as I stumbled into the bathroom, I noticed something strange. In the mirror, my reflection looked wrong. My skin was pale, almost colorless, my eyes hollow and dark, as if I hadn't slept in weeks. And when I opened my mouth to scream, the only sound that escaped was a faint, rasping whisper. The whispers never left. Every night I hear them, growing louder, closer, like they're waiting, watching. And now, when the ghost parade passes my house on Halloween, they stop, their empty eyes fixed on my window, their hollow voices calling my name, inviting me to join. I know one day I'll have no choice but to step outside, and when I do, I know I'll never come back. There was a legend in our town, one that parents tell their kids every Halloween as a warning. Never go to Finch's pumpkin patch after dark, they'd say. People claimed the place was haunted, that strange things happened there. Kids who went after dark were said to disappear, swallowed up by the rows of pumpkins, never to be seen again. I always thought it was just a story meant to keep us from wandering around at night. But last Halloween, my friends and I decided to test the legend. We'd heard the stories and seen the pumpkins from the road, rows upon rows of them, twisting vines and dark, looming scarecrows watching over the field. It was the biggest pumpkin patch around, and we dared each other to go in after midnight. It was just a harmless dare, or so we thought. We waited until the town's Halloween festival was over, sneaking away from the bonfire and making our way to Finch's patch. The place was dark, the only light coming from the full moon overhead, casting long shadows that stretched across rows of pumpkins like skeletal fingers. The scarecrows, tall and ragged, loomed over us, their heads made of burlap sacks with hollow eyes and crooked smiles stitched in the black thread. There were 3 of us, me, my friend Jack, and my little sister Lily, who had insisted on coming along despite my protests. Jack was the first to step into the patch, laughing and kicking at the pumpkins as we made our way deeper into the field. "Come on, let's grab the biggest one and bring it back," he said, his voice loud in the quiet night. We wandered deeper into the rows, looking for the biggest pumpkin we could find, but the deeper we went, the more twisted the pumpkins became. They were large and misshapen, their skins dark and warty, with strange, twisted stems that looked like claws reaching for the sky. Some of them even had faces, gnarled, unnatural faces, like they'd been carved by something that didn't understand what a face was supposed to look like. I tried to laugh it off, telling myself it was just shadows and my imagination playing tricks. But as we went further, I started to feel like we were being watched. "Hey, did you hear that?" Lily whispered, her voice trembling. We stopped, listening. At first, all we could hear was the rustling of the leaves in the wind, but then, faintly, we heard it. A low, soft whisper, like the wind itself was speaking. It grew louder, rising and falling in eerie murmurs, as if 1,000 voices were whispering secrets we couldn't understand. "Probably just the wind," Jack said, but his voice sounded shaky. We kept walking, but the whispers followed us, growing louder and more insistent. Then, out of nowhere, we heard a soft thud, like something heavy falling nearby. We froze, scanning the rows around us, but there was nothing, except for the Scarecrow. It was no longer in its spot by the entrance. It stood just a few feet away, its empty eyes staring straight at us, its crooked smile wider than I remembered. "That Scarecrow, it moved," Lily whispered, clutching my arm. "No, it's probably just a different one," I stammered, trying to convince myself as much as her. But as we turned to go back, we saw it again, another Scarecrow just ahead, standing in the row we'd come from. Its head was tilted, watching us with that same twisted smile. And then we noticed the pumpkins. They were closer somehow, each one turned toward us, their twisted faces seeming to leer in the moonlight. The vines around them had stretched out, creeping across the ground like fingers reaching toward our feet. "Let's get out of here," Jack said, his voice barely a whisper. We turned and ran, stumbling through the rows, tripping over vines and dodging the pumpkins that seemed to crowd in closer and closer. The whispers grew louder, a frantic, furious hissing filling the air around us. Then, just as we reached the edge of the patch, we stopped. The scarecrows were everywhere. There had to be at least a dozen of them surrounding us, their heads tilted, their eyes empty but somehow aware. Each one stood perfectly still, but as we started, I could swear I saw them breathing, their chests rising and falling, their heads turning ever so slightly to watch us. And then, from the darkness, I saw something else. It was a figure, tall and thin, with a face made of the same twisted, gnarled pumpkin flesh as the ones in the field. Its eyes were hollow, its mouth carved into a jagged grin that stretched across its entire face. It wore a cloak of vines and leaves, and it moved toward us with slow, deliberate steps. Who are you?" Jack stammered, backing away. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it raised one long, clawed finger, pointing directly at me. "You took my children," it whispered, its voice like the rustling of dead leaves. "Every pumpkin in this field is one of my own, and you came to steal them." "We didn't know," I cried, feeling my heart pound. "We didn't mean any harm." The creature tilted its head, the hollow eyes narrowing. "They are mine, bound to this field, and now so are you." The ground beneath our feet shifted, and I felt something cold wrap around my ankle. I looked down to see a vine curling around my leg, pulling me into the dirt. I screamed, clawing at the ground, but more vines slithered up, winding around my arms and my waist, holding me in place. Jack and Lily were caught too, their faces pale with terror as they struggled against the vines that held them tight. The creature leaned closer, its grinning face inches from me. "Every year they come to me, offering their lives to keep my children safe. Now you will be one of them. The last thing I saw were the creature's hollow eyes, staring into mine as the vines pulled me down into the earth. The next morning, the townspeople found our empty bags and hats lying at the edge of Finch's pumpkin patch. No one knew what had happened to us, but the townsfolk noticed something odd that year. There were 3 new scarecrows standing in the field, each with a twisted, horrified face, their eyes wide and empty, their mouths stretched into silent screams. And every Halloween since, 3 more scarecrows appear in the patch, their faces familiar, their expressions frozen in terror, as if warning anyone who dares to enter after dark.